All right, thanks everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Paul Johnston. I come from the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences here at Mount Royal University, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's event that will be addressing this question: should the Chicago principles be affirmed at Alberta universities? So this is the first of these kinds of events for this academic year in the Critical Thinking series at Mount Royal University. This series is organized by the Rational Space Network at Mount Royal. This is a group founded by no less than Dr. Francess Widdowson from the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies, and she has been a champion for academic freedom and free expression here and across Canada. The Rational Space Network includes members of the Mount Royal faculty whom we have discovered rarely agree on very much, but do agree on promoting unfettered academic inquiry, robust debate, critical thinking, and evidence-based approaches in post-secondary education, and ensuring that university administration provides a secular environment for students and faculty. The Critical Thinking series, including today's event, has substantial and very much appreciated sponsorship from several sources, including the Endeavour Fund of the Faculty of Arts at Mount Royal, the Faculty of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies at Mount Royal, and the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship. This latter group is a Canada-wide organization dedicated to maintaining freedom in teaching, research, scholarship, even when, in pursuing their scholarly goals, faculty or students take positions that are not in accord with popular beliefs or values. And we are indeed pleased to have the president of that society, Marc Mercer, on our panel today. The Critical Thinking series began here in the Jenkins Theatre last year. It comprised moderated discussions of what many would regard as difficult, if not contentious topics, and which features panelists more or less on opposite sides of the issue in question. Last year, the series included discussions on whether Canada's support of Israel is justifiable, on whether universities should vet who speaks on campus, on whether capitalism is sustainable, and on whether trans activism negatively impacts women's rights. Let me mention a couple of events the Rational Space Network is planning for this winter. Anthony Magnabosco will be coming to give a lecture on street epistemology. That'll take place on a Thursday evening. And he'll also do a workshop on the God belief. We're also working on an event centered on the question, are Indigenous ways of knowing compatible with science? So do watch for announcements of those events. All of the Critical Thinking series events to date were, I think, conducted with considerable civility on the part of the panelists and the audiences, much to the credit of the Mount Royal community, which might lead us to believe that erosion of academic freedom evident on some Canadian campuses is not an issue at Mount Royal. But that sheen of academic freedom has since tarnished somewhat here. In the spring, a scheduled talk by Iranian dissident and proclaimed atheist Armin Navabi fell in the same week as the horrific massacre in the mosque in New Zealand, and a segment of the Mount Royal University community decided the timing and subject of the talk was therefore inappropriate. Even hate speech indicated some. They pressured the university administration, who then canceled the talk on short notice. The administration later apologized publicly for deplatforming Navabi, and we hope to get him back for a Critical Thinking series event. This fall, another incident relevant to academic freedom here occurred when Mount Hecht, a social geographer at Mount Royal, published in the Vancouver Sun a controversial op-ed on the relationship of diversity and social trust in Canada. Outrage and criticism ensued here, which of course we can all support in principle under the banner of academic freedom and freedom of expression. But that's something quite different from attempts at deplatforming or obstructing speakers or writers with unpopular views, as we saw just 2 days ago with a petition to the Toronto Public Library requesting cancellation of a scheduled talk by controversial feminist Megan Murphy, who incidentally was a panelist here at one of our events. Fortunately, the Toronto Library did not succumb to that petition, and her talk went ahead. Since Hecht's op-ed, a student-filled school to Northern Europe that Hecht had organized, and which I understand included examination of issues around social trust in Europe as one of the learning objectives, was canceled by university administration owing, we are told, to the lack of support from faculty in the geography program, although not all were consulted, I've learned. And they deemed Hecht's views too extreme to allow him to lead the field school, which does raise the specter of a possible breach of academic freedom. This prompted a letter from the Society of Academic Freedom and Scholarship to the university requesting explanation of that decision. This incident brings to mind comments from Jennifer Bankier, a law professor at Dalhousie, who wrote, "Academic freedom is violated when sanctions are applied to academics because of their ideas or attitudes. It is easy," she writes, "to respect the academic freedom of your friends. The real test of commitment to academic freedom is whether it also regulates your conduct toward your enemies." I think that's a bit of a strong word here, let's say intellectual adversaries. She writes, "Many academics fail this test and attempt to damage or destroy the careers of their adversaries by abusing their power within academic decision processes." So regarding today's event, I'm especially looking forward to hearing the panelists' views. I think this may well be the most important event so far hosted in the Critical Thinking series, as it will, I suspect, probe the very foundations of academic freedom and free expression at Mount Royal and Alberta universities more widely. This event comes in the wake of a decree from the current Alberta government that post-secondary institutions in the province comply with the document concerning free speech and academic freedom on campuses, a document produced by the University of Chicago in 2014, known as the Chicago Principles, which, as I read them, are intended to guide universities in facilitating the free exchange of ideas. So with that, I would like to turn the floor over to our moderator, Sinclair MacRae, who will outline the format for today's event and who will introduce our speakers.
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. First of all, thank you all for coming out today to hear the panel, and thanks to the panel members for making their way here, some from quite far away. Thanks to our sponsors. As Paul mentioned, I'm Sinclair MacRae. I'm a philosopher. One of the dangers of having a philosopher moderate a panel like this is that nobody else will get a chance to speak, perhaps. So be careful about that. Anyways, I'd just like to introduce the other members of the panel, and I'll outline the planned process anyways. I don't have a prearranged list of questions. I mean, I have some ideas and questions to ask if necessary, but the format will be, we'll give 7 minutes to each of the panelists to express their views. And I was just joking with Marc, it would be ironic if we had strict restrictions on what people could talk about in their 7 minutes. There are no restrictions. And then 3 minutes available to everyone to respond as they wish. And then we'll take it from there. And I think the way we were conceiving it is that the first hour or an hour and a half or so probably will involve discussion among the panel members and myself. And that will leave open the last 1.5 hours or so for a broader discussion involving audience members as well. So let me begin with the introductions. I have to put on my old man glasses. First of all, in order, and this will be the order that we speak at the beginning as well. We have David Climenhaga. I'm just going to read the bio. David is the author of the AlbertaPolitics.ca blog, is a journalist, author, journalism teacher, and trade union communicator who has worked in senior writing and editing positions with the Globe and Mail and Calgary Herald. AlbertaPolitics.ca has in excess of 1.2 million page views per year, and also appears on Rabble.ca. His 1995 book, A Poke in the Public Eye, explored the relationships among Canadian journalists, public relations people, and politicians. It's out of print. He transitioned unexpectedly from journalism to working for the trade union movement after the strike at the Calgary Herald in 1999 and 2000, where he had been vice president of the local 115A of the Communications, Energy and Paper Workers Union of Canada, now known as Unifor. So welcome, David. Next to David is Marc. Marc Mercer received his PhD in philosophy from the University of Toronto in 1991. He's taught at St. Mary's University in Halifax for over 20 years, eight of which he chaired his department. His main interests are in the philosophy of mind and value theory. Marc's opinion pieces on freedom of expression, universities, and other topics have appeared in a variety of Canadian newspapers and magazines, including the Ottawa Citizen and University Affairs. Marc joined the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship in 2006 in response to his university's treatment of a colleague who posted the Gillen's Poston cartoons on his office door. He became president of SAFS in May 2015. Next to Marc is Marc Schroeder, past president of the Mount Royal Faculty Association. He's been teaching computer science at Mount Royal since 2002, including courses in introductory programming, hardware and system software, computer architecture and low-level programming, functional and logic programming, and the study of programming languages and paradigms. He's also worked as a software developer and teacher in industry and continues to work on occasion as a consultant. Marc's academic interests include programming languages, object-oriented programming, functional programming, low-level software, web development, computer science education, and pedagogy. Next to Marc is Francess. Francess Widdowson received her PhD in political science from York University and is currently an associate professor in the Department of Economics, Justice, and Policy Studies here at Mount Royal. Francess has co-written and co-edited with Albert Howard 2 books on Aboriginal policy, Disrobing the Aboriginal Industry, The Deception Behind Indigenous Cultural Preservation, and Approaches to Aboriginal Education in Canada, Searching for Solutions. Her latest book, Separate but Unequal, How Parallelist Ideology Conceals Indigenous Dependency, will be released on November 5th with the University of Ottawa Press. So welcome to all our panelists, and I just want to add that I don't conceive of this as a debate in any way, more of an open inquiry into the issues surrounding the Chicago principles, freedom of expression, academic freedom, principle of dissent, all of those issues connected to that. And so with that, I'll stop talking and I'll invite David up to the platform to give his presentation. David.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm going to have to put on my old man glasses here. So, and I did sort of conceive this as a debate when I wrote this up. So you'll forgive me if my tone's a little conflicting. You have to give your head a shake when the likes of Jason Kenney and Doug Ford say they're trying to protect your right to free speech. Lately, both of these gentlemen have championed the idea of compelling universities and other post-secondary institutions to adopt the Chicago principles, supposedly to protect free speech on campus. In the academy, where most of you work and study, and in media, where I've spent much of my career, we all tend to be free speech fundamentalists. Our lives may not depend on it in this fortunate country, and I'm speaking of Canada, not Alberta, thank you very much. But our ability to work, to pursue our careers certainly does. So what on earth is wrong with adopting a formal charter committing ourselves to promoting, as the Chicago Statement would have it, the freedom of others to promote a lively or fearless freedom of debate and deliberation, but also to protect it when others attempt to restrict it? What could possibly go wrong? Well, let me suggest to you that documents rich in anodyne sentiments are not always exactly what they appear. Consider the founding documents of the United States. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. So says the Declaration of Independence. Yet if you examine the nitty-gritty of the U.S. Constitution, you will soon see that one of its principal purposes is to do the opposite, to ensure the preservation of human slavery to the benefit of the slaveholding class. The United States lives with that curse of that original sin to this day. Now, the report of the Committee on Freedom of Expression is no Declaration of Independence, but I would suggest to you that the circumstances in which it was written point to another motive for the adoption of such statements by institutions whose purpose is to further the interests of society's elites. No, this is not about protecting brave academic researchers seeking to overturn the accepted wisdom of our epoch, or, heaven forbid, grubby reporters looking for a story with a dash of scandal. Just consider for a moment the history of our Premier, Jason Kenney, and his commitment to free speech. Here's a man who got his start as a conservative activist trying to prevent his fellow students from speaking out in favor of their reproductive rights at the University of San Francisco. When the school's administrators weren't impressed by his message of censorship, he tried to get the Catholic Church to intervene and deny it the right to call itself a Catholic university. Here's a fellow who, as a member of Stephen Harper's Conservative cabinet, tried to keep a British MP out of the country on the preposterous grounds that the man was a threat to our Canadian national security. George Galloway's real sin: he advocated for fair treatment of the Palestinian people. Here's a person who, as our premier, has set up a war room and an inquiry, an inquisition more like, I would say, to intimidate and silence Canadians who oppose expansion of Alberta's fossil fuel industry. These are not the actions of a committed free speech activist. And there's no evidence that Mr. Kenney has had a recent road to Damascus moment. On the contrary, the phrase wolf in sheep's clothing springs to my mind. So what's going on? As I argued in a recent blog post on this topic, the Alberta government's objective in pushing this statement is quite different from preserving free speech. In significant ways, it's the opposite. The Minister of Advanced Education says piously it's important post-secondary institutions remain bastions of free thinking and dialogue where all members are able to engage in true discovery and learning. Of course, our institutions, to a significant degree, our institutions of higher learning are bastions of free thinking and dialogue. And this event is an example of that. And no safe space or trigger warning, both reasonable and common sense protections in the kind of societies in which we now live, is likely to change that. So you could argue this is a solution in search of a problem, and maybe a problem that doesn't really exist. You could ask, what's the harm in inoculating ourselves against some future assault on freedom of expression by adopting the Chicago principles? But cast your minds back to the histories and likely motives of the people in government who are advocating this, and I'll tell you what I think it is. If they're not interested in promoting free speech, in which case they wouldn't be actively engaged in efforts to stifle free speech, it's likely they're interested in privileging and promoting certain kinds of speech. And that this is just an excuse to suppress criticism of false, misleading, factually unsound narratives promoted by people who make a practice of attacking the academy and those who study in it. What narratives do I have in mind? I give you the denials that climate change is real and caused by human activity. I give you the preposterous conspiracy theory the oil sands are being defamed by mysterious big money plotters in the Rockefeller Center in New York City. I give you the Friends of Science, a group that must always be mentioned with quotation marks around its name. Remember, the statement was adopted by the University of Chicago in 2014 to push back against popular opposition to racist speakers on campus, prohibitions of sexist, racist, and homophobic attacks on students, and demands to change the names of buildings and remove statues celebrating historic figures known for their racism or cruelty. So like the US Constitution, you could say, you could argue, the Chicago Statement has an agenda that is not plain upon its face. The statement and its supporters make a straw man of safe spaces where marginalized student groups can gather free from harassment by people who dislike or disagree with them or just dislike them, which, forgive me, seems pretty reasonable to me. How is shutting down such safe spaces doing anything except empowering bullies who already have full access to soapboxes from which to proclaim their messages? The goal, I say to you, is to suggest a safe space is to create a safe space for only one set of ideas, the economic nostrums and social conservative rigidities of the increasingly radicalized North American right. If Mount Royal University wants to test my theory, I suggest you offer an honorary degree to David Suzuki and put out a press release about it and just see what happens. And I'm not talking about what happens on social media. I'm talking about what happens in the cabinet room of the Alberta Legislature building the next time those great free speech advocates talk about your budget. Now, even the Chicago Statement concedes a university may restrict speech that falsely defames individuals, constitutes a genuine threat or harassment that invades privacy, and so on. But we do have laws. We have a constitution that do those jobs better than an unenforceable charter ginned up to force universities to welcome extremists who share an agenda with the worst parts of this government's political base. In other words, the main reason for pushing this statement is to open campuses wide to anti-women's rights extremists, advocates of Trump-style racism, and worse, in my view. It's hard to believe that's not Premier Kenney's idea, too. And those are my remarks. Thank you very much.
I like the Chicago principles. I don't like governments dictating to universities what they should do. I can agree with David on a number of points that he makes about the government and its attempt to impose policies on the university. Consistent in my dislike of governments imposing policies on universities. I think that they should not be doing it in any number of areas, so not just here. But I do like the Chicago principles, and I think there are good grounds for universities having something like the Chicago principles as part of their statement of what the university is all about. Well, let me ask you, what would you prefer? Suppose it's the case that you have to choose between these two situations for yourself or for others. One is that you have true beliefs and sound values for the wrong reasons, and the other is that you have false beliefs and unsound values but for the right reasons. Now, of course, we want to have true beliefs and sound values for the right reasons, but if that's not available to you, which do you prefer? I think your preference will indicate the sort of university that you want and the sort of things that matter to you. Now, what do I mean by the right reasons and the wrong reasons? The right reasons are reasons of evidence and argument. The wrong reasons are the social and psychological pressures that are brought to bear on people to believe one way and to value one way. Now, we're humans, and as humans, we're very susceptible to the pressures, psychological and sociological pressures, to bring our beliefs and our values in line, in conformity with those around us, those we wish to, those we like, those we wish to be part of, the groups that we want to be part of. These pressures can bring us, without our thinking about it, to conform in our beliefs and our values with others. Now, the right reasons are reasons of evidence and argument, and as university people, as intellectuals, we want to understand things as they are. We want to interpret and appreciate as we will, and we want our beliefs and our values, our beliefs to be true and our values to be sound. But we want to do so on the basis of evidence and argument. We want to have explanations for why we believe as we do and as we value as we do. Now, it's required then, if in a university community, if this is what matters to us, if intellectual community, leaving each other free to believe as we will and value as we will and explain and discuss as we will, it's important for us that there not be the pressures of social or psychological pressures to get us to believe one way or the other. Now, when speakers are shouted down or are officially, if words from the president come that these are not the university views, then that's a way of creating an in-group and an out-group, and that's a way of applying pressure to people to believe in conformity with a set of doctrines. Now, the idea, a university as a place of intellectual community, this has never been a majority view at universities. It's always been present. It's never gone away. Sometimes it's more prevalent than at other times. But most universities have been universities with a fair bit of oversight and control. I'm thinking primarily of religious institutions or military colleges or whatever. The idea there is to have a set of doctrines, a set of dogma that can't be questioned. And it's within that set of doctrines or that dogma that one investigates, that one interprets, and that one appreciates. And the goal is to create people who then move out into the world, into the professions, into their lives, and make their way into the elite of the society. In the 40s, 50s, 60s, the other idea, the idea of intellectual community, the idea of questioning anything that you want to question, allowing any view to be spoken, starts to become more prevalent, and maybe into the 60s and 70s. But again, I think we're moving back to the idea that a university is not a place of intellectual community, it's rather a place where we come to have the skills and attitudes that make us acceptable to the social elite. So I'm trying, as far as I can when I talk about these things, to make this distinction and as far as possible, articulate the attractiveness of a university of intellectual community, a university where people are not shouted down, where any member of the university community may create an event, bring speakers onto campus, talk about whatever they want. Well, what are the advantages? Why would we want such a place? I think for us, the advantages, first of all, this is what we love. That we are intellectuals, we do like to investigate things, we like to make the results of our investigation known, we like to explain what we're thinking, we like to hear from others, we like to engage in criticism and critique. But what about the people outside the university, the people who might be funding the university as citizens? What do they get from that? Well, one thing they get from that are students who leave the university with at least some degree of intellectual and moral autonomy, at least some ability to think for themselves. The other thing they get is research that they might be able to trust. Now, if research is emanating from a university where you may not say certain things, you may not go down particular roads, then the public sees that research as having to toe a line. And if the researchers have to toe a particular line, if they're not free to investigate what they want and come to the conclusions that they want, then their research can't be trusted. So those are the two reasons I think that people outside the university should be keen to support universities that are places of intellectual community, where we go about the business of investigating things as they are, talking about them, bringing our views to each other's attention, and engaging in criticism and critique. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for coming. I'm going to start with some positives about the Chicago principles. When you critique something, it's often good practice to start with some positives. And I think, of course, the Chicago principles do a fairly good job of pointing out the importance of freedom of expression. And I think from what we've heard so far on the panel, and I think it'll be universal, and probably universal among the people in the audience, freedom of expression is, of course, a very important principle, and in fact so important that it's upheld in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. The other thing I wanted to say by way of introduction, although it wasn't in my bio, I serve on the executive committee of the Canadian Association of University Teachers, and in my capacity here, I'm not speaking for CAUT at all, but it's maybe unsurprising that a lot of my views are fairly closely aligned with what the CAUT has to say on matters of academic freedom and so forth. I do encourage you to go to their website and check out their policies and statements on issues like academic freedom. The question before us today is, should the Chicago principles be affirmed at Alberta universities? I'm going to argue no to that question. And I'm going to be arguing from a few different perspectives. The first is that there are, of course, issues with the Chicago Principles statement itself. I don't disagree with Marc about much about the overall intent of having the overall intent of our academic community at universities, of course, being centered around inquiry, rigorous scholarly investigation, and so forth. But the Chicago Principles don't guarantee or ensure that in any way. I'm also going to argue against or no to the question for a few other reasons. One is, of course, in Alberta, universities and colleges are being, in fact, told they have to adopt the Chicago Principles as a matter of government diktat, and I think that's something we should all push back against. It's a violation of institutional autonomy, which is, in fact, threatens academic freedom, as I'll discuss. And as David has already pointed out, it constitutes politically motivated overreach. There's an agenda here. And if we're concerned about stalking horses, we should be concerned about that. So first of all, the Chicago principles themselves, they miss or evade the point. First of all, the principles frame freedom of speech, or in Canada, as we also often term it, freedom of expression, as the central value of the university, which sounds good, but it ignores multiple complexities that we need to be alive to. The singularity of freedom of expression as the overriding value is problematic. But it's unsurprising given the mandate of the committee at the University of Chicago that established them. In fact, it was much like the McKinnon report in Alberta recently. The question or the mandate was so narrowly framed that the committee probably had very little alternative but to produce a statement that focused singularly on freedom of speech. It also begins by quoting former University of Chicago President William Rainey Harper as saying that the principle of complete freedom of speech on all subjects has from the beginning been regarded as fundamental at the University of Chicago, and that this principle can neither now nor at any future time be called into question. Of course, framing anything as never being subject to questioning is dogmatism. So I think we should be suspicious right off the get-go. Another big problem with the Chicago Principle Statement is that it conflates freedom of expression with scholarly inquiry. Those are not the same thing. Academic freedom and freedom of expression are related concepts, but they are not identical concepts. That distinction is not made in the Chicago Principle Statement, and that is very problematic for reasons we can discuss. But scholarly inquiry and freedom of expression are not the same thing. The statement ignores the heterogeneity of university spaces and roles. Universities are not one homogeneous space, hallways being indistinct from classrooms, from labs, from lecture halls, and so forth. And of course, roles at universities vary by faculty, student, member of the general public, and administrator. Any statement that's to be meaningful has to take that heterogeneity into account. It also ignores the positionality of students or prospective students who may be coming to the institution. For example, in educational research, it has long been, the positionality of students and prospective students has long been a subject of research. Members of marginalized communities, for example, immigrant and poor communities, often face discourses that position them as not having the same right to higher education as other members of society. If universities are not alive to those tensions and focus exclusively on freedom of expression, we can't have more nuanced discussions about how to deal with real issues that come up when they come up. And that ties into my last point about sort of big picture issues with the Chicago Principle Statement itself, which is a real lack of specificity. It's frankly a very vague document. So the health of the university actually relies on multiple factors. One, of course, is academic freedom. Academic freedom is key. Again, not the same thing as freedom of expression. Of course, second of all, it has to, a second key ingredient of what makes a healthy university is that it's also a campus community where all can come together and can be included in discussions. Freedom of expression by itself is a necessary but not sufficient condition to achieve a healthy university community. We have to recognize that if certain members face excluding discourses or are not able to participate in the university community to the same extent as others, there can be freedom of expression for a privileged group to as high a degree as we like, but it's not actually serving its purpose to society. The principles ignores addressing the real difficult issues that often come up in these matters. It kicks down the road the real challenges and complexities when difficult issues are faced by the university community. So what the principles have to say about that is that there are certain limits to freedom of expression on campus. And that one of the reasons that they may be limited is when speech is otherwise directly, I'm quoting, otherwise directly incompatible with the functioning of the university. In addition, the university may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of expression to ensure that it does not disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. The devil's in the details. Who gets to interpret when that kind of restriction on free expression or campus events applies? The principles give us no meaningful criteria or direction in how to interpret that very overbroad statement. It leaves it up to who? It leaves it up to academic administrators. In fact, the very last group of people that we should be entrusting sound at the rigorous scholarly inquiry with at the institution. So I think I'll wrap at that point on problems with the principles themselves, and turn very briefly to my second point, which was that imposition of the principles undermines institutional autonomy. In fact, no less than U of Chicago President Robert Zimmer recently spoke out against Donald Trump's March executive order in the United States that universities adopt the Chicago principles, saying that it was a violation of institutional autonomy. The government, it establishes the government as a party to defining the very nature of universities and the discussions they have on campus. Issues of free expression on campus, academic freedom, and inclusion, removing barriers to equitable participation, those are matters for the university community itself to decide and discuss, not have imposed upon them from the outside. You can't have academic freedom if you don't have institutional autonomy. And lastly, to touch on David's point, why is our government actually attempting to impose the Chicago principles upon us, especially when, as David pointed out, there is no widespread free speech crisis on campus. It's to further the narrative that right-wing politicians have so often tried to establish and amplify, which is that universities are in big trouble and need fixing. That serves certain political actors very much to their benefit, and I think if we don't push back on that, we're being played. When Minister Nicolaitis was asked by the Edmonton Journal earlier this year for examples of issues on campus that the principals were to address, he couldn't name any examples. We actually have, this is dangerous because we actually have real threats to deal with. Universities are actually under strong attack from many different directions, one of which is the increasing casualization of academic staff. Here at Mount Royal, most of the faculty are on short-term 4-month contracts. You can't have meaningful academic freedom, regardless of what policy statements or collective agreements say, if your faculty complement can turn over every 4 months, and they always run the risk of not being reappointed. Those are the real threats we deal with. Declining funding, corporatization, and attendant threats to shared governance. Subordination of post-secondary education to private interests through, for example, the imposition of performance-based funding regimes, which are coming next year according to a recent UCP legislation. So universities are actually under real attack, and focusing on the Chicago principles and focusing on a phony free speech crisis is a way of distracting our attention from the actual existential threats that undermine the health of our post-secondary system.
Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you especially to the panelists, people who came from out of town, but I especially wanted to thank Marc Schroeder for being the only faculty member at Mount Royal University who would come and argue, give a critique of the Chicago principles. And this is not because he's the only one who's a critique of the Chicago principles. It's because many faculty members, although they're opposed to the principles, do not want to come out publicly and say why they are opposed to them. And I find that is a very interesting question. If you are opposed to something, why would you not want to give your reasons for why you're opposed to it? Anyways, I'm tempted to call my opening remarks, "It's 1984 all over again." This is because I have never been so aware of George Orwell's famous novel than I am today. The concepts that he created, the Ministry of Truth and Thought Crime, for example, are becoming increasingly familiar. Especially relevant was his statement that, quote, "If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. This is why I support affirming the Chicago Principles. I want to be able to tell people what they don't want to hear." I should stress that this does not mean that I am comfortable with the government imposing the Chicago Principles. I think this is a point of agreement that all panelists share, that this is very dangerous when the government can tell institutions what they should be doing. The Chicago Principles themselves, however, are sound. And I think I'm hoping that's what we can focus our arguments about, because we want to get to the bottom of why, if we decided it as a university, why just to do it, why wouldn't we want to do it? And in fact, I personally tried to bring the Chicago Principles to Mount Royal University in 2018, but my efforts to do so were blocked by the president of Mount Royal University at the time, David Doherty, who prevented us from having the discussion at General Faculty's Council. So I'm not going to change my mind on the principles just because the government has decided that they wanted to impose them, although I'm opposed to the imposition. The important paragraph in the Chicago Principles, which I just want to read out to you, which is the one which I wholeheartedly agree with. This paragraph states the following: "The university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forward are thought by some, or even by most, members of the university community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the university community, not for the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves and to act on those judgments, not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. Indeed, fostering the ability of members of the university community to engage in such debate and deliberation is, in an effective and responsible manner, is an essential part of the university's educational mission." And I think that paragraph is very, very important, and I think that sums up what I think a university should be all about. In reading these words, it is clear why many professors in Alberta don't want to affirm the Chicago Principles, why they're opposed to affirming the Chicago Principles. Many professors, although this is where Marc Schroeder and I would disagree, are actually intent on suppressing ideas that they perceive to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. They argue that some ideas may constitute violence, hate speech, or cause harm, and that it is the duty of a university to prevent them from being expressed. One professor, and this professor I actually invited to this panel and she refused, Dr. Rangwala, even asserted that, quote, "the free speech issue is a red herring for the delegitimization of the academy as a force for critique." And we can talk about this more in the question period, because I really have a hard time understanding what this means, that the Chicago Principles are an instrument to delegitimize the academy as a force for critique. I do understand, however, the references to hate speech and the harm that could be caused from speech. I understand the sentiments behind these statements, because most professors are humanitarians. They're very, very concerned about the impact that ideas have and what's best for society. The problem, however, is that allegations of hate speech and harm have a highly subjective quality to them. One colleague at Mount Royal University, for example, includes in her definition of hate speech the following: an abusive comment that is likely to expose an individual or group to hatred or contempt. Similarly, it is maintained that violence is conduct that is likely to cause psychological harm. Since these definitions are based upon how others choose to react to what one says, almost any comment could have these perceived negative consequences. The purpose of a university is to pursue the truth. This means trying to understand all facets of ideas, including whether or not they are hateful or harmful. But how can this be determined before the fact? A discussion must take place to determine the nature of an idea and how its acceptance or rejection would impact society. So we need to, if you're going to say something's hateful or harmful, you have to discuss how this is the case, and if you're going to make certain ideas off limits, it's going to be very difficult to make that determination. The last 6 months at Mount Royal University has exposed the difficulties with these definitions. 3 important discussions: whether or not trans activism negatively impacts women's rights, if Islam should be defeated, and why ethnic diversity might harm a country's social trust, were opposed on the grounds that they could potentially expose an individual or group to contempt or harm. Most faculty members who made these accusations refused to enter into an academic discussion. The Ministry of Truth had already knew what was right, and any challenge was a thought crime. That's generally the sense that I got from the discussions. But why would university professors declare that conversations about these matters were off limits? The most common opposition to open inquiry has its roots in the position first articulated by the philosopher Herbert Marcuse, known as repressive tolerance. Marcuse maintained that it was wrong to allow ideas to be expressed that had a demonstrably aggressive or destructive character because they undermined the conditions for peace, justice, and freedom. Such views should be censored, Marcuse argued, before pernicious movements can become active and begin to influence society. In making these arguments, the question of who decides what is aggressive or destructive did not trouble Marcuse. He envisioned a politically correct intellectual elite using self-evident experience and human reason to distinguish between true and false solutions. I have referred to this attitude elsewhere as one of politically correct totalitarianism. And this is a serious problem at Alberta universities. Whether it's a crisis or not is another matter, but there certainly are attempts to stop us from talking about various ideas. Affirming the Chicago principles will enable us to declare, as a community of scholars, that we oppose this intellectually corrosive stance. We need to show that we care about open inquiry, critical thinking, and our ability as autonomous thinkers to discuss contentious topics. While I don't expect that affirming the Chicago principles will do much to change the climate of repressive tolerance in the short term, it is a small step in pushing back against politically correct totalitarianism. The culture at universities needs to change. We need to be free to examine all ideas. Otherwise, we will not be able to pursue the truth. While it is a problem that the government is imposing the Chicago principles, one of the beneficial effects is that it has enabled us to begin to have this important discussion, even if it means that we are telling people what they don't want to hear. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks everyone. I'm already tired of sitting. Research shows that sitting is not good for your health, so feel free to get up and move around. Don't be subjected to the tyranny of sitting. So the only reason I'm standing now is for that reason. Now I'd like to, I guess should we go in, I think it makes sense to go in the same order, or do you want me to switch it up? I think it makes sense to go in the same order with the responses, so feel free again. each of our panelists will take just a few minutes to give their thoughts and reflections in response to the ideas that have been expressed so far. Go ahead, David.
Well, I would say a couple of things. I'm skeptical of the idea of politically correct totalitarianism being a problem in our institutions. Now, I say that from the perspective of the only person on this panel who's not an academic, and I'm not part of the Mount Royal community, so there may be things I'm not aware of, but this, again, sounds to me like an effort to describe demands by groups that want to be treated fairly as an effort to shut down people who disagree with them, and I don't know that that's necessarily the case. I wondered too, Francess, about if you're attributing the wrong motive to the people you talk about doing this, or the people who wanted to, you've said they wanted to declare the debate to be off limits, but I feel some sympathy with members of an academic community who do not want to advocate a cause they may believe in because they feel that it might result in threats, abuse, doxing, or perhaps professional consequences because they don't hold a point of view that is politically correct in terms of, or maybe we should rephrase that as administratively correct. In terms of the prevailing views of the elite that runs the university. So I guess I would say I'm a little, I'm a little skeptical of that. On the topic of delegitimizing the academy as a force for critique, I think the explanation is that what she's talking about is the Chicago principles that tend to create circumstances in which you can attribute to views that are not supported by empirical evidence an equal value as if they were. My background, as you know from my opening, was in journalism, and we see this all the time in journalism, that there's an intense desire to always get what we called internally get reaction, which means get the other side, get the opposing view. Well, there are certain cases where there really isn't a credible opposing view. And so what journalists do, and what I think people in the academy are talking about doing here is they run outside the normal realm where you would go for a legitimate disagreeing opinion, and search out people who have views that are really beyond the pale. And we see this in arguments about some of the social issues or some of the critical issues facing Alberta. So, for example, the notion that the government is advancing that there's an almost criminal conspiracy by American business people to fund environmentalists so that the American oil industry will do better. It's thoroughly debunked. It does not hold water. And yet the media continually goes back and gives that view equal weight. And so I think you have to, within academia, you have to just trust that instinct on your own selves too. And so that's one of the problems I have with, as an observer from outside academic world, I have with the Chicago principles. As you can tell from my remarks, my principal problem is that I profoundly distrust this government and its motives, and I think that they are trying to achieve goals other than what they say they are. So then that goes back to the point that people made earlier, and I tried to address that in my opening remarks. But so there's nothing really wrong with the Chicago principles, then why not just adopt it and maybe it can help us? I'm skeptical of that when it's really. But we've heard raised today Doug Ford and Jason Kenney by me and Donald Trump by someone else. But these are all people who are pushing for the adoption of this thing, and they're pushing for it for a reason, because it conveys some political advantage to them to do things that are not friendly to free speech. So I guess those are some thoughts that occur to me from what others have said.
Great, thanks, David. Marc?
I was happy to hear Marc point out the strange irony in the Chicago principles where something is off limits for discussion. I remarked on that when I was reading it as well. Even whether universities should be places of free expression is something that should be discussed, can be discussed at universities. I want to take issue with something that Francess said as well, although I think it might just be I'm taking issue with the way she put it rather than the idea. Francess said that the purpose of a university is the search for truth or truth. I don't think so at all. I think the purpose of a university is to be an institution that makes intellectual community possible. Now, as members of such a institution, as members of a university community, what are we doing? Well, not all of us are searching for truth, but certainly a lot of us have research as what we're doing. But the university itself isn't. Its purpose isn't to find and disseminate the truth. No, that's the purpose of the researchers within the university. And the university does well to make it the case that researchers can go about their business and criticize and critique each other. Now, I said not all of us are pursuing the truth. I don't mean some of us are pursuing political justice. There's also interpretation of works of art, interpretation of culture. We also engage in appreciation of those phenomena that move us. And what we attempt to do is try to articulate how we are moved. Central to the university is, of course, trying to describe how things are as they are, but we also engage in interpretation and appreciation. My difference with Francess is that I don't think it's the university's purpose to body forth truths or knowledge. I think the university is an institution, and its ways and means, the function should be such as to support a community of intellectuals who are engaged in intellectual work. Now, intellectual work means criticism and critique. We want to be a culture of disputation, a culture of criticism. This is getting moved to the side a bit. We're becoming more a culture of celebration of differences, or celebration of cultures or whatever. But that's not what we're really about as a community of intellectuals. As a community of intellectuals, quite often what we do is we take our identities and we hold them at arm's length. We hold them at arm's length so that we can examine them, subject them to criticism. And this can be frightening, and it can be hard. But that's part of what we do, and we do it because we love it. So I'm going to take issue with Marc on a point here. Marc says, well, the university's not a homogenous place. It's heterogeneous. There are the hallways, the cafeterias for us. Well, no. We're not a multicultural society as a university. What we are, we're as monocultural as an army, as an armed force. We have a purpose. We have a mission. Our society, our multicultural society, doesn't have a purpose or a mission, except maybe to support well-being of people generally. But we're here to engage in intellectual pursuits, and that includes the students. We should think of as apprentice intellectuals. Well, we should think of ourselves that way as well, because we're never going to become as good at conceiving the world as intellectuals as we should. But our students, too, they're here because they want to be intellectuals. They want the halls and the cafeterias and all the rest to be part of the institution that is their community as intellectuals.
Yeah, thanks. So, Marc spoke about the Chicago principles and the value in their affirmation with respect to countering psychological pressures, which may cause us to conform. I actually tend to agree with Marc in many ways, maybe not entirely in his conception of the university and communities of scholarship, but I simply don't see anything in the Chicago principles which will achieve what Marc aspires to achieve. I don't see how there's any specificity in the list of principles that actually speak to countering psychological pressure at all. They don't give any guidance to administrators or to members of university boards or senates into how to deal with firestorms or contentious issues when they arise. I find it to be a very unhelpful document. If what Marc wants is what he's described, the Chicago principles don't get us there. With respect to a few things that Francess said, there are in fact, it's true, many faculty in Alberta who have spoken out against the Chicago principles. I don't think you should take their absence from panels like this as unwillingness to actually elucidate their positions. I think they simply view and I don't want to put words in people's mouths, but I've spoken with many of them, they don't view these kinds of forums as places where there can be a discussion, a nuanced discussion in the way that they believe is necessary. So for example, Dr. Rangwala at the U of A, if you want to know her views on the Chicago Principles, she has a very lengthy and I would say lucid essay that's been posted online that you can find within a couple of keystrokes if you want to know her views. I think she has problems with this kind of format as a venue for a fair exposition of views. I think that's why some academics aren't here. It's not because they're unwilling to make their views known and to engage in critique and so forth. I don't think that universities are being overrun by politically correct totalitarians. I don't think that's the case at all. I think when I speak of the university as a heterogeneous environment, what I mean is that in classrooms, in lecture halls, in graduate seminars, in research labs, and so forth, there is rigorous scholarly inquiry going on every day. It's very long, painstaking work. No one should think that venues like this constitute scholarly inquiry. This is not, there are a few of us on the panel who are professors. This is not an academic discussion. This is not scholarly inquiry. This is not how academics actually engage in their practice. I think that's why some faculty members are skeptical of this kind of event. Francess made reference to the Rational Space Forum, was it a few months ago or last year, concerning trans rights, which I actually participated in. I was actually hesitant to participate in that event because I said, this is not my area of academic expertise. I am a computer scientist. And she said to me, don't worry, we're just, and again, to paraphrase, we just want to show that we can have this kind of public discussion. It's not an academic event. I agree completely. It wasn't an academic event, right? So I think it's unfair to characterize colleagues as being politically correct totalitarians because they're skeptical that certain kinds of public debates or debate-like panels are some kind of scholarly inquiry. I think their concern is that it can undermine the reputation of the university by painting something as a scholarly event when it's in fact not. I think I would have a bit more respect for Rational Space if it actually didn't engage so much in punching down towards members of vulnerable communities and actually challenged real systemic power. I double dog dare Rational Space to have an event that questions, or that asks the question why levels of climate change denial in Alberta are the highest in the country. That would be a really interesting discussion to have that would actually challenge people in power and would be a real test of whether at a university we can have a conversation about difficult issues. Just to pick one example, or the David Suzuki example, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Let's have a discussion about whether or not we should invite David Suzuki. People may forget, but before the university conferred their honorary degree on Dr. Suzuki, the UCP, Jason Kennedy's UCP, actually ran a petition to have the U of A uninvite him as an honorary degree recipient. These are our so-called champions of free speech who are pushing the Chicago Principles imposition. So, Rational Space could actually try punching up, could try actually questioning people in real positions of power. I think that would be a much greater test of whether or not universities are places that knuckle under to power or not.
Great, thanks, Francis.
Marc is beginning to make me very angry, so I will just, I'll try to calm down and not start to go at him about this. Rational Space does not punch down. That is an absurd accusation. We had an event on Israel-Palestine, and we tried to get at Israeli domination over Palestine, allow this discussion to happen. People would say the trans activists are punching down on Megan Murphy's head right now. The minority of feminists who cannot speak out about what they perceive to be oppressive activities being leveled at them by trans activists. So Mark's idea of punching up or punching down comes from a particular perspective which I really take issue with. And I think that's a completely unfair characterization of the Rational Space Network. And we would be happy to have any of these events that he's suggesting. To think that we are not interested in challenging power in Alberta or Canada or internationally, I think is a very unfair characterization. So, I hope I'm not being too snarky about that. Anyway, a colleague recently said about a week ago, trans rights are human rights. This is not an issue for debate. That was actually said. This is a major issue that needs to be examined and discussed at a university. There are a number of professors at Mount Royal who do not think that this is a matter to be discussed. And that is not going to work well in an environment where we're trying to pursue the truth and where we're trying to understand things. This is the issue here. In terms of, I think that David mentioned, ideas that are beyond the pale, ideas that have been completely discredited, those kinds of claims, which, I personally think that there's a number of issues that are like this. But I do hear those kinds of claims being made about things which I think are valid areas for discussion. And I'm very hesitant to make any sort of argument that there's a completely discredited area that cannot be talked about at a university, because we need to be able to discuss it to figure out whether it warrants being completely discredited or not. That's the difficulty. I have a book coming out shortly about Indigenous dependency, and I'm fairly sure there's going to be a number of people who are going to say that my work is completely discredited. I don't think that's the case at all. I think my work is very well argued, very well researched, and should be discussed. There might be things wrong with it, but we need to be able to discuss it to be able to figure out whether or not that's the case or not. And this is the difficulty, is who is making the decisions about these sorts of matters. And really, the only way where we can go into matters, try to figure them out, is if we have open discussion. It's very, very difficult to say what is this idea that now should be off limits. And there's a number of areas now which are like this, where it's just being declared, this has been decided, this is totally discredited, we should not discuss it at a university. And in order to make the university an intellectual environment, we need to be able to open up everything for discussion. And I think it's a very problematic stance to try to limit what it is that people can say and what they can talk about.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. I'm just going to take a few minutes to process and give some feedback and some analysis of what I've heard. So I have only had a hazy idea of what the panel members were going to say. So here's how I see my responsibility playing out. My trepidation of being involved in panel discussions like this is partly connected to the danger that these kinds of events can slide into incivility and instantiate exactly the opposite forum or fora in which critical inquiry can take place. So let me see if we can do that. And this also is a way of speaking in part to Marc S.'s concern. So I detect a bit of a contradiction in the notion that if it's the case that we're not doing scholarship or research, then there's nothing left over of value for us to do. And what I take to be the value or potential value of a panel discussion like this is the opportunity for people to engage in principled dissent, making arguments from various principles and ideas in support of views to advance discussion about particular ideas. And about those particular ideas, I'd like to just make a few comments. My analysis of the comments from the panelists is that the discussion has focused on three different and separate issues. So I think it'll be useful for us to narrow that down a little bit. The first one concerns the political implications of the government imposing something like a set of Chicago principles on institutions, universities in Alberta. That's one focus of discussion among the panel members. A second one focuses on the justification of and the critical evaluation of the Chicago principles themselves. And a third issue is the issue of the arguments in favor of support for free inquiry, academic freedom, or right to academic freedom, right to freedom of speech, right to principled dissent. So I think it might be helpful for us to distinguish between critiquing the Chicago principles, which I take to just be an invitation to have a deeper discussion about the value of free inquiry, principled dissent, freedom of speech in a university setting, to distinguish between a focus on just those principles. I have a number of objections to the Chicago principles I was thinking if we did go in that direction, and instead to try to bridge the other two. Right? So I wanted to ask a question of anybody who wants to respond to it, try to bridge the other two. So the first one, again, is my understanding based on what people were saying, were various concerns, mostly concerns, expressed about the political climate, political potential duplicitous or secretive or arch motivations of politicians imposing something like the Chicago principles on universities in Alberta. And how does that come, how can we compare that or think about that in relation to deeper questions about the justification for a right to freedom of expression, academic freedom? I'm interested in the latter, obviously, as a philosopher, although I have some interest in the former as well. And it seems to me there's an interesting, I have some questions about the way in which these two go. So before we go down this road, I just want to say it's not my panel, but we need to decide as a group where it is we want to focus our discussion. And we can talk about all three of those things or any of them. My own sense is that a focus on the Chicago principles themselves will not be so fruitful. Rather, it would be better to focus on the underlying justification for, as Mercer put it, the university as a culture of disputation. What are the conditions that must be in place in order for the university to discharge that responsibility to its members and to society? That's where the arguments for the justification for free inquiry, critical debate, principled debate, that's where it really comes out. So I'm just framing this to say, we have a number of choices about where we want to take this inquiry, where we want to take this discussion, and we might, probably won't, agree about which is the most fruitful one. From my perspective, the intersection between the political question about the imposition of the Chicago principles on the universities in Alberta and the deeper underlying question about the justification for, just say, freedom of expression or academic freedom, I know they're different things, that to me is the most interesting one. So I'm maybe just expressing a personal opinion here, but I just want to try to avoid us getting off track from talking about things that are incidental to these deeper issues. So let me begin with a question. That's actually not a beginning. Exactly something that I would say. I had a question just to understand better for David, first of all, and Marc also, you can jump in here as well. So there seems to be a tension between the idea that there are political motivations that lead to the imposition of a set of principles in the universities, with the actual content of those principles understood instead as, let's say, maybe this is too much to assume, but this is certainly what we're interested in, but let's say promoting a climate in which there could be free inquiry, one where there's not a chilling effect on what people want to investigate, what people want to study, for the benefit of themselves, for their own freedom of expression, for their own development, for society as well. So how can we reconcile a confusion or a criticism of the political motivations of a government that many people suspect with the content of the message that people should be free to engage in free inquiry? What am I missing here?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that you're missing anything, but the problem with situations like this are oftentimes that words on their face have different meanings than they mean to initiates. And furthermore, that sometimes words on their face in charters of this sort, not necessarily the Chicago principles, but we'll call them what you will principles, mean different things to different people or mean different things at the same time. I mean, this is part of the history of human communication is sometimes messages are embedded in other messages. And I submit to you that this is a case where that goes on, where on the face of it, this is an anodyne and harmless message. But when you dig into it, there are coded meanings. You all know what I mean when I talk about coded meanings. When people talk about immigration, for example, in terms that they're talking about immigration policy, but the terms are coded to express a racist message. We see this kind of thing all the time. So my submission, my starting point with this is that on one level, the Chicago principles are harmless and in fact helpless, but on another level, at the same time, the adoption of charters of this sort are intended not to protect free speech, but to suppress it. And so I think you do have to deal with the nitty-gritty in an academic community if you're having this kind of thing imposed on you. Because you have to ask the question, what's the government's motive and what's really going on
Fair
here?
enough. Maybe
How's
I
it
can
likely to
interrupt for a
play out?
second.
Sorry.
Sorry, David. Can you explain more carefully and clearly for me how the impositions of the principles limit or somehow impair the free inquiry of whatever people study at universities?
Well, because I think the goal is to open the door to people to come in to the university campus and to essentially disrupt the life of the university. And there's an element here of what can I say of justifying bullying. So I want to go back for a second to this whole question of safe spaces. It's reasonable of people in a university community to have safe spaces and also to go out and debate. But if you use safe spaces or even trigger warnings saying that what I'm about to say might offend you, but there's an effort there to make it difficult to express certain thoughts. That's the route by which free expression in the university community is stifled. I do want to challenge you that if you've got to have this thing, use it for good. So if the government imposes it on you, I would urge members of the community to use it in cases where the university administration is trying to suppress speech of the kind that elite institutions usually try to suppress. This would be things, for example, like Marc raised about workers' rights, the rights of academic workers who are now treated in some ways worse than people working in unionized unionized support positions. This is one of the really shocking things that's happened in the academic world in the last 30 years has been I guess you could say, the alienation of academic workers from the work that they do and from the value they contribute to society.
Do you want to follow up?
Sure, I'd love to. So, first of all, if the question is about the dangers of government diktat around the Chicago principles, yeah, I think we can really delve into that one quite deeply. But just really quickly, even if it wasn't that the government was imposing the Chicago principles on Alberta universities and colleges, I mean, I don't see value in adopting them anyway. I sat in the Faculty Association President's office for 4 years dealing with controversy after controversy coming up. There's nothing in the Chicago principles that gives any real guidance on how you would address issues of academic freedom and free expression on campus. It's just too vague. But the reason that I think a lot of governments, or at least certain kinds of governments and political actors are pushing them, is because they want to establish and they want to amplify a narrative that our public universities are essentially broken. That they've been subverted by an out-of-control radical group of students. In the States, they often especially point to students, but faculty as well. And this idea that universities have gotten out of control. Why are the Chicago principles appealing to some? I think again for certain politicians and political actors, it gives them a way to push that narrative. I think it's going to be very attractive to many administrators to basically fall in line with that. Because the Chicago principles essentially give administrators and other people in positions of relative power, it would give them the ability to interpret matters of free speech and when it could be regulated and when it should be. It would leave it purely to their interpretation. I think also it fits really neatly with a neoliberal conception of how the world should work. So I mean, as many people in the audience are probably aware, neoliberalism is the dominant rationality of our day. And the Chicago Principles really fits with this neoliberal conception of the power of the marketplace. People who think that the university is a marketplace of ideas, I would argue, don't understand what a university does. A university is not a marketplace of ideas, but by focusing singularly on freedom of expression and this idea that we just get as much mimetic material spread as possible and we see what's taken up. I think it really speaks to furthering that kind of neoliberal conception of how our society should be organized. I think that's very dangerous. So there's all kinds of, I think, interlocking, imbricated reasons why certain kinds of governments, including the Canada UCP, are interested in pushing this. But again, to sum up, the harm is, I see it as being, really twofold. The first is that it distracts our attention from the real attacks that are taking place. Defunding of universities, making it harder for students to attend because tuitions will skyrocket. Imposing performance-based metrics and performance-based funding attached to that really subverts the public interest to private interests. These are the things that are going on while we squabble about an inflated, I would say, kind of a hallucination about a free speech crisis and politically correct totalitarians on campus. And the second is, again, there are tensions here that universities legitimately have to deal with. So yes, universities do have to be concerned with protecting aggressively academic freedom. We don't want to lose rigorous scholarly inquiry. But universities also have a legitimate interest in making sure that the university is open to all members of society. So when we talk about freedom of expression and academic freedom, we have to make sure that all people from all walks of life can come and participate in that. And only the university community can have that discussion. When the government steps in and says, no, it's really about this, when they take away our own ability in our senates and in our boards of governors to hash these issues out as a community of academics, they've really undermined the institution. Right? So, and without institutional autonomy, you can't have the kind of academic freedom that people like Francess and Marc and myself actually value so highly.
Thank you. Maybe I can just see if I'm following correctly. So we can draw a distinction between the potential pernicious effects of government imposing something like the Chicago Principles on universities, without at the same time declaiming our support for the value of free inquiry and the associated rights. Is that a fair characterization?
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about the Chicago Principles or other formulations of academic freedom and free expression. You can separate that to a large extent from discussion about imposition of the Chicago Principles by government for their own self-interested reasons. You can separate those, but when the government imposes, it undermines the kinds of things that we're all saying we value in really fundamental ways.
Right, here's the
Sinclair, I just want to say I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said about that separation, but I do want to remind people that sometimes documents can mean the opposite of what they say. And the U.S. Constitution was a good example that I gave you. The Declaration of Independence talks about all people being created equally, but the nitty-gritty of the U.S. Constitution is to justify and uphold a slave society. And the U.S. Constitution only began to mean what it said it meant until they had a great civil war in which more than 100,000 people had to die. So, then the meaning came closer to what we understand it to be today. But the fact that documents may not mean what they seem to say really does matter, I say to you.
Yeah, fair enough. So you can say that the reason why we're able to say something like what you just said is because we operate in a climate in which free inquiry is possible in the first place.
If you don't like the U.S. Constitution idea or example, I understand that the North Korean Constitution to some degree is based on the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, if you want a model for corporate governance, you should read Enron's principles of, what do they call that, their mission statement and value statement. Yeah, same thing.
I have to tell you, I've gone through life with a mission statement that I'll never have a mission statement. So.
No, the puzzle I was raising before was that what happens when something that you oppose in process advocates for ideals that you support? That seems to me part of the contradiction here. Marc, sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that the work that Marc and David are doing in looking at the background of the movement by politicians to bring the Chicago principles to Albertan universities is valuable and important. Let's find out what the mission is of the people who have brought them forward. Let's find out what their agendas are, and that way we'll be able to avoid them. And that way we'll be able to develop statements that don't promote the ends and goals that David and Marc find behind the politicians who are promoting this. It's good work, it's excellent work, and what it does is it helps us to avoid going places we don't want to go. I do think there is an important place for statements about the university from the university. To whom are they directed? They're directed to people outside the university. They're directed to people within the university, and let them be crafted by the people within the university. The Chicago Principles, I think the statement has many of the flaws that Marc points out. Well, other people have thought long and hard about these things, and we can bring them into the discussion as well. One of my favorite papers is by Ronald Dworkin, We Need a New Conception of Academic Freedom, where in fact he talks about freedom of expression on campus. To my mind, a strangely underappreciated, underread, under-discussed paper, so I commend it to you. There are the 1974 Yale principles. There are the principles that professors at Trent University drew up in the 1970s or 1980s. We can talk about how best to frame a statement that expresses our commitment to freedom of expression on campus, which is different from academic freedom, but academic freedom protects it, and they have much the same rationale. We can devise statements that express our commitment to freedom of expression on campus, that state why we are committed to freedom of expression on campus. Our commitment stems from a love of what? We can say what that is. This statement would have to be somewhat vague and indeterminate. I don't know that I agree with Marc that administrators are going to get lots of false positives and lots of false negatives, and so when it but what's necessary, of course, is a culture in which freedom of expression is our commitment to freedom of expression on campus is understood as stemming from our love of inquiry, our love of trying to understand things, our love of interpreting things richly. And if we see that, and that becomes part of the culture, then maybe some of the concerns that Marc has about interpreting these documents will, never disappear. I mean, there's always going to be problems in interpreting the documents. So I think that Marc and David are right to be concerned about the origin and what might get, despite what we want, might be the product of such a statement. And if we know that, we can go some distance at least to avoiding the outcomes that we don't want to have.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say a few things. The first is that I think getting into a discussion about whether or not the government should have imposed the Chicago Principles, for me, is getting a bit off track. Because I think there are professors at Alberta universities who are opposed to the Chicago Principles, regardless of whether the government would have. I don't think it really matters to them whether the government is imposing them or not. They don't like the Chicago Principles. and that's kind of what I'm interested in finding out, is that what is it exactly, especially about the paragraph that I mentioned, about shutting down ideas, and the language used in the Chicago Principles is offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. Those ideas, stopping those from being expressed. And at least what I've seen in the discussion in Alberta is those are not the words that are used often, but they are similar. Things such as hate speech, the notion of hate speech, which is a very difficult concept to figure out what exactly is hate speech and what is not hate speech, as well harm, psychological harm. We're seeing that come about time and time again. And I think this notion that ideas, and I think this gets one of the crucial points of contention probably between Marc S. and David and perhaps Mark Mercer, I'm not sure, and me, is this sort of notion of discussing ideas which could make certain vulnerable people nervous about coming to the university, or somehow be marginalizing to them even further. And this has to be, we have to be concerned about this, we have to figure out how to do this. And I find those kinds of, those for me is what is the crucial area. Trying to talk that through as to how that would work at an institution, to get at Mark M's point about creating the conditions where people can pursue the truth. Not the university as a place that pursues the truth, but facilitating the conditions where that can happen. If we are going to be very, very concerned about how this could impact certain groups, how is that going to facilitate that mission? I think that there's a tension there about that. And although, you know, I do agree with Mark, is that I don't really see it as being a quote-unquote crisis that we have here. I'm sitting here talking to everyone, so it can't be that bad, obviously. But there is tremendous pressure to be worried about what you say, that you could say something that could potentially have the effect of doing something, and I really worry about that. Like I want to try and say as honestly as what I feel about something, put that forward, and if I'm wrong, people can challenge me. They can even get angry at me if they think what I've said is really insensitive. You know, this is all part of that process. But if I'm going to, and I think just to bring it back to Orwell, which is what I was trying to get at earlier, I think Orwell was really onto something when he brought up this notion of thought crime. That's a very interesting concept. Thought crime is you sense that where you're going to go with this thought is going to have some negative consequences, because you might want to express your thoughts. And therefore, it's better not to think that. And personally, I feel that. I feel the pressure. When I'm starting to think a thought, which I think, ooh, this could have a negative impact some way, I go, oh, better not think about that. Like that's kind of the, you know, because then if I did think about it, then maybe I would feel the need to express myself. And if I felt the need to express myself, I could have all these problematic consequences. And I think that's kind of I think that's one of the more significant areas that we potentially could talk about.
So let's pursue that a little bit. So I'd like to jump in as well here. So Mark asked, in response to one of the things you were saying, this is the way I see it, you can see the imposition of the Chicago Principles as an opportunity to discuss the deeper underlying rationale and justification for our basic rights as educators, as researchers, as scholars. And there's value, much value. One of the arguments that Mill makes, for example, is that belief in right to freedom of he's talking about political speech, but a right to political speech becomes a dead letter in the absence of critical inquiry into the justification for that very right. So we talked a little bit about the political implications. Let's switch over then to talk more about this deeper issue. And I'll do that, I'll give you an example of that. So I see, like I said, position of the Chicago Principles as an opportunity to engage in exactly this kind of discussion, which I think is useful. So here, I'll give you an example of a criticism that speaks to the worry that Francess just raised, and also wanted to mention the issue of moral distress. But let's talk about the first one. So one of the passages reads in the statement of the principles, it's a long sentence, although the university greatly values civility, and although all members of the university community share in the responsibility for maintaining a climate of mutual respect, concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. So I interpret the concept of respect, not in terms of being polite to others, but in terms of in terms of acknowledging their status as bearers of dignity, capable of choosing and thinking for themselves. And it's condescending and patronizing to think that people should be treated in a way that is polite by making judgments about what they should and shouldn't be exposed to, think about, and hear. Same thing goes in the case of moral distress. The phenomenon of moral distress, it's kind of looming in the background here, is the idea of people being pained by the thought that others are transgressing their moral ideals or their moral standards. And that leads into the question, which exactly these freedom rights encourage us to entertain, which is who determines what counts as the truth about moral questions. One of the problems with the issue of moral distress is it's also patronizing and disrespectful in the more significant, meaningful way that I just identified, because it presumes that I should be able to judge for you how you should judge important issues in your life and in our society. And the whole part of the rationale anyways for something like political speech or freedom of thought, freedom of inquiry, is exactly to encourage you to see yourself as a self-respecting person, by engaging in that debate, and by considering and entertaining arguments on the various sides in that. So it seems to me this is a nice opportunity to talk about the deeper basis. One of the problems with the phenomenon of moral distress, apart from it being patronizing and condescending, is that it doesn't actually do any work. If something is wrong, then the reason why we should prohibit it is because it's wrongfully harmful, not because some people are pained by the thought of its existence. So it doesn't actually do any justifying work. Anyways, I'm kind of conflicted here because we said that we would stop talking and invite questions from the audience. So maybe we should do that now. This time I knew it was going to fly by. People said to me, oh, this is great. People said to me, you're going to be there for 3 hours? I said, there's not going to be any problem filling up 3 hours. In fact, I'm going to rant just for another minute. It seems to me that one of the things that is in the background of this debate also is the worthwhile movement to become socially active. I think that's a great thing to encourage in people, but it's like the responsibility that goes with academic freedom, that it also entails the responsibility that we focus and hear both sides. Here, I'll give you an example. I mentioned this at lunch. I read in the New York Times last week that social science researchers are interested in the question about the value of humility, and the social psychologist researcher asked the question, how can we teach students to be humble? And that's exactly the wrong question to ask, of course. It's not like you can learn to be humble, just like you can learn the rules of the road. Humility is a virtue we acquire through practice over time. It turns out that people who have humility are more inclined to be tolerant and open to the ideas of others. Anyways, yeah, I said I wasn't going to rant, but I did rant a little bit there. I'll stop. So I think we've got this microphone. You can come down here. I think people, if you're comfortable just asking questions from where you're sitting, that would be fine too.
You might be difficult to hear on the movie camera.
Well, because they're recording. So yeah, maybe if you want to make your way to the microphone.
I can always pass it around if people want to come up.
I could walk around too if you want. I always wanted to be like this.
Like
yeah, exactly. There you go.
It's just the right height for me.
Yeah.
It was meant to be.
I hope I'm not taking up too much time by making 2 points. First point, I just want to express a wish. I wish that this could be a more sustained event by making it written. I would really like to see people put forward their views in print with the opportunity for other people to respond and so forth. There's some really wonderful advantages of doing things in writing. Okay, that's the first point. Second point, I'm on both sides of this issue because I do think that Marquez and David have a good point, that there is something to be feared about the government imposition of the Chicago principles, that this is not entirely honest. But I would like us to think about how the principles be adopted. And I'm not so much thinking in terms of how the secondary institutions frame the principles, but what sorts of institutional arrangements can we put in place so that the government is forced to adhere to what they say they support.
May I speak to that? Yeah, thank you very much. So I think, I'm going to come back to the second point you made about, how can we actually enshrine this in a more permanent way or in a way that actually has some teeth. I think, first of all, though, you have to go back to understanding the bread and butter of the university. People have used the terms free inquiry, academic freedom, freedom of expression. Those are terms with related but different meanings. But the bread and butter of the university, and Marc spoke to this, is that you have faculty, members of the academic staff who are engaging in research, and you also have members of the academic staff engaging in teaching, which is something they do with their, for and with their students. CAUT conceives of academic freedom as protecting freedom in those two things, plus two more. What's called intramural academic freedom, which is the right of faculty to criticize their institution and participate in its governance, and extramural academic freedom, which is the right of faculty to exercise their rights as citizens, which includes their free expression rights, without threat of institutional sanction. Okay, so freedom of inquiry and research, freedom of teaching without being subject to dogma, freedom of intramural academic freedom, and freedom of, intramural speech and extramural speech. Those are core elements of academic freedom. That's what is most fundamental to protect at universities. That is the bread and butter, and if we lose those things, all four of them, together, then universities can't actually uphold their responsibilities to society and the public good, okay? That's what's important. So to your point, how do we actually protect those kinds of things? In Canada, academic freedom, unlike freedom of expression, which is in the Charter, the only legal meaning that academic freedom has is, in Canada, it's a matter of labor and employment law, right? It's what collective agreements say. So at Mount Royal, for example, the Mount Royal Faculty Association has bargained into our collective agreement, into our terms and conditions of employment, academic freedom rights that protect freedom of inquiry and research, freedom of teaching, intramural speech and extramural speech, free from institutional sanction. That is how we defend the bread and butter of the university, because that then has legal teeth as a matter of labor and employment law. And if a faculty member feels that if they're concerned that their academic freedom has been violated in any of those four categories, they can go to their union, and the union can actually grieve, and there's a legal process through which they go. This brings us to the Chicago principles. If we view these things rather as a matter of institutional policy and things that boards of governors adopt, they don't have that kind of legal teeth, and they're not, when there's actually a contentious issue, when there's actually a problem or an alleged violation of academic freedom, those policies are not worth the paper they're written on. So the Chicago principles are a very vaguely written document that do not give us the guidance we need, and they don't have the legal teeth to defend academic freedom in the way we actually need. That's what actually matters.
Well, if I can just throw something in here, I think you can use documents like that, though, when you're trying to litigate it through collective agreement law. Because you can say this is a statement of intent by the institution, and then you can use the legal structure that you have. I know this was what you were getting at, is where are the legal structures that we can use. So I think that's something to think about, that to some degree, democracy depends on an unspoken agreement that we'll all be democratic. And so one of the things you can do as members of a democratic community is use documents like this by referring to them and pushing back on how the administration is using them. I just wanted to say one other thing in response to your first question. Of course, I'm an opinionated guy, and I put a lot of my opinions in print. They're found at albertapolitics.ca, and there's a comments section, so please come and read it and comment.
I just wanted to comment as well, and I agree that this document, the Chicago Principles, is not a guide to how to deal with all these problems. I see it more as a symbolic document which allows us to affirm our commitment to open inquiry and to some extent push back against attempts to stop people from discussing ideas which are thought to be harmful or offensive or violent or all these other terms that are being put forward. I said it in my presentation, I think what we have at the universities is a cultural problem. I don't think any legal document or anything is going to solve that problem. The cultural problem is many people are afraid to say what they think is true because they're going to have all sorts of repercussions about it. And this feeds into Marc's point about the contract faculty. This is especially serious with contract faculty members. Marc Hecht, who wrote that piece in the Vancouver Sun, he's a contract faculty member. His position is under, we're very concerned about his position at Mount Royal. As Paul Johnston mentioned, his field school was canceled. If he had been a tenured faculty member, it would have been much more difficult to have that kind of response to him trying to state what he thought was true in the Vancouver Sun.
Couple of things. It would be a great idea if we could have a more sustained discussion on David's website. I'm not sure that's the best place for it. But
Feel free.
yeah, I mean, David's got his website there. Let's.
And if I could just jump in, the Society for Academic Freedom and Scholarship has a newsletter that comes out every 4 months. And that is a great forum for discussing these ideas, and hopefully some of these presentations that were made today can actually be put in the newsletter to continue the discussion.
Maybe there's, we should decide between you where the discussion should take place rather than have it in both, fractured discussion, part on David's website and part in the newsletter.
Well, I think you need a forum in your institution, but you're certainly welcome to come and read my blog in the comments.
I'm going to be writing something for the SAF's newsletter talking about this.
Yeah, so maybe we should invite David to contribute to the AFS newsletter. I also want to say that Marquez is the point about academic freedom being protected by labor relations. It all depends on, I think Francess would agree with me on this, it all depends on how much groupthink there is at a university. And from what I've seen, universities do sometimes succumb to groupthink. And so I do not think that that collective agreement that the faculty has with, I'm not sure who they have the agreement with, but I'm not sure that it does its proper job. And so maybe there's a good reason to have another element, legal element, that protects universities from their own groupthink. Let me say one more thing, because I can see that you want to come in on this.
There are also lots of other
There's
people
people
waiting.
behind you too.
Yeah, okay. I mean, the thing of it is that Well, in Ontario, there's a policing mechanism for their implementation of the Chicago principles. I don't know how well that policing mechanism is working. I mean, there's another organization, not the government itself, that does this. I don't know how well that's working. And this is just off the top of my head, but this is a human rights issue. Here in Alberta, why don't we hand over the enforcement of the principles to the Alberta Human Rights Commission? I'm not saying that's a good idea, but like, it's the kind of thing that maybe we should think about.
They're anti-free speech.
Yeah, they don't let freedom of expression. And this was a shock to me in the 1990s when it finally dawned on me that the human rights people were anti-civil liberties.
Yeah.
Wow, and I'm still recovering from that shock.
Yes.
All I can say is maybe I don't know enough about the Alberta Human Rights Commission.
We should move on. Do you want to?
It occurs to me that, actually I hadn't realized that the government had asked specifically for the Chicago principles, so I just want to bracket that aside for a second. But it occurs to me that governments ask universities to not necessarily adopt specific policies, but produce policies in line with provincial law. So we've got health and safety policies, and we have sexual harassment policies, and we have sexual violence policies. And nobody really seemed to pay any attention to what universities did with respect to any of those kinds of policies. I'm thinking in particular of the kinds of sexual violence policies that have been adopted on campus and some of the problems that go along with those particular policies, not the least of which is that they suck up an entire quadrant of funding for little mini bureaucracies that are aimed at doing work that some could argue is work that ought to be done by other agencies in society. So thinking around those kinds of things, I wonder if the issue is not that, because no one's rushing to set up a committee to draft, well, some people are rushing to set up committees to draft the policies, others aren't. I know they are here at MRU. They don't seem to me to be rushing to set up bureaucracies to police freedom of expression and academic inquiry. And I mean, those are two very different kinds of things, right? And I think nobody would want that in the same way that everybody wanted a bureaucracy to police sex on campus. So that's a kind of question that I have in the back of my mind, why, right? The second thing I just want to say, and I'll wait in line for other questions that I have, but the other thing I'm kind of wondering about is how much of this is about the fact that it empowers administrators. Because essentially what we're talking about is crowd control, right? And administrators taking a principled position in support of academic inquiry. And I've been a vice president of a faculty association and a chair of a department and worked in those various different kinds of capacities and know very well that faculty and faculty associations aren't necessarily going to be too thrilled about policies such as these that are essentially empowering administrators whose job has become more or less a branding exercise within a university. So for the kinds of work that I want to do, which, when I came out of grad school, I was a card-carrying socialist feminist, right? And I've been researching freedom of expression in relation to obscenity law, and I find myself teaching a course this term on hate speech, where we're looking at Mill and we're reading Marcuse again. And I know that the kind of research that I want to do, which is in defense of sexual freedom, could not be published in the contemporary context in a Canadian university or in an academic journal, because it goes against the current doxa, despite the fact that I would identify myself as being on the left. So I find myself not really knowing how to sort out these particular kinds of issues, and I turn to people like you who have been thinking about these things for maybe longer than I have to maybe give me some insights into the issues that I've raised.
About your first two questions, I think that they do come together in one way. You might be aware that the University of British Columbia does have on campus a bureaucracy charged with freedom of expression.
Now, that would be something to do some research on.
Yeah, part of the follow to the Jennifer Burdell affair.
Okay, yeah.
And this is, I think, it's an example. I was going to say a pretty clear example, but maybe I'm wrong about that. But anyway, it's an example of administrative capture of these issues. And it's not clear that that body is protecting freedom of expression on campus. The other thing about...
Just let me interrupt. I think it's important that we do make a distinction between freedom of inquiry versus freedom of expression, right? Because when I think of freedom of expression, I think of, you know, the Hyde Park Free Speech Corner,
Yeah.
right? Where you go down and you watch what the nutters have to say. And I don't think that that's what's going on in universities. Universities are engines of exclusion, in fact, right? In which they are designed to keep out the nutters, right? Which is why we don't invite the anti-vaxxers to come in and have a platform with a scientist or a biologist.
No,
Right?
that's fair. There's freedom of inquiry,
Yeah.
yes, but I think that the best way to protect freedom of inquiry is to protect freedom of expression on campus.
And I guess I wonder about that.
Well, again, it's not Hyde Park because we get people, members of the university community, I think, should be free to invite people. Right, and so that, I think, is the freedom of expression. What should matter to us is the fair allocation of scarce resources, if there are scarce resources. And maybe first come, first served is a fine principle in some contexts, not in others. But by freedom of expression, I mean freedom of expression, yes, in the context of university life.
I think this document's been designed to force the door open for what you call the nutters, because some of the nutters are in this government.
But
I heard you say that, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I wonder if it's not worth maybe making the distinction a little clearer, Mark, in terms of how you're expressing it, right? Because...
Well, if no one invites the anti-vaxxer on campus, then the
Well,
if they do, people who want to come and talk about it are free to do so.
Right.
Those
I understand the value of that in relation
and those members of that society that brought the person on campus are free next year not to vote for the stupid idiot who invited them on, are free to criticize in the student newspaper, and unfortunately a lot of campuses don't have newspapers these days, so you know that's a problem. That's how it's taken care of.
Who pays for the crowd control?
And
Well, I think the university should, in the same way the university pays for the electricity and the plumbing, that should be so that those who want to create a heckler's veto are not able to do so. But I just wanted to talk about your second point. Yes, I think if one thing that worries me about universities these days is increasing professionalization. And professionalization means something like finding objective criteria to measure a professor's worth, rather than looking at the professor's entire career. Now, if you are not able to publish your work in a peer-reviewed journal, publish that on a blog, but do put it in your annual report and do...
Sorry, I should have prefaced it by saying I don't care anymore. I was promoted to full professor.
Yeah, okay, it's
all
wonderful.
But I do know that I've got already 30,000 words written called for an article titled "Manufacturing Rape Culture" that I would never ever publish anywhere.
Oh, publish it, you must. But you must.
You must publish it.
Anyway, if you're a non-tenured professor, an associate professor coming up for tenure, or assistant professor, associate professor going up for promotion, what you want to hope for is a committee that actually reads your material and makes their academic decision, their academic judgment on academic grounds and on academic grounds alone. Not looking at, counting the number of peer-reviewed publications, estimating the worth of the value of the journal, things like that. I think we have to turn university culture around a little bit, and unfortunately I think unions are part of the problem here, part of the professionalization of the university. Yeah, small part. The thing to do is to publish the stuff, get it out there, and if there are journals that are publishing it, well, still people are reading it, and they're able to make decisions about it for themselves.
I just want to say something quick again here, and apologies to our next questioner who's been waiting for a long time, but it's easy for faculty members to talk about, to take the position that, well, we should really open the place to all kinds of speech, no matter how offensive, because they have a safe space in this, and it's called the faculty lounge. And so one of the parts of this debate has been to deny other groups a safe space. So maybe we should apply the same standards across the board. Anyway, I just wanted to pry that in.
Is everyone done? Nobody has a comment?
We all have more things we want to
We all have more things to say.
I've just got a quick question specifically for the no side, the no Chicago Principles side. What would you do if, like, your political opponent, someone who doesn't like your ideas, someone who's not like, oh, I don't think immigration is great, but I don't think unions are great? What do you do if that guy becomes administrator and is all like, all right, no leftist speakers of any kind? That's a bit of an extreme slippery slope thing, but like, it's on the table. America elected Trump. The Mount Royal University could elect Dean Trump if they decided to feel like it.
Well, I don't think either David or I have argued that there should be no right-wing speakers on campus. I haven't even said what my political affiliations are, although you could probably guess. But
You said unions like 3 times. You're
Yeah.
the leftiest person that I've seen.
by everyone's standards, I'm radical. By everybody else's standards, I'm pretty middle of the road. But yeah, no, I don't think David or I have said at all that people who have different political views than ours should not be able to speak on campus. So I'm not entirely sure what the question is.
No, I'm generally referring to the third one Francess mentioned, the guy who's like, diversity reduces social trust.
Oh.
That's not in itself a radical position. That's not kick out the immigrants. What do you do if the guy who becomes the person who decides who's allowed and who's not allowed is like that, but towards the left? The guy who doesn't want unions.
Let me answer that, because this is the situation in which I find myself. I am a trade union official, and as is Marc, but I am an employee of a union, a staff person of a large union in Alberta that represents people, and we have elected a government in this province that is anti-union, that is attempting in a number of ways to shut us out and change the terms of our members' employment and their pensions in ways that I think are extra legal. So what we do is what anybody does in a democratic society. We take advantage of the public forum, and we know how to use it, and we know how to make our views clearly expressed. Although I'm having trouble doing that into a microphone. And if necessary, we protest in the streets, and we also litigate. And we use the courts. So, I mean, this is the situation, you're describing the situation the trade union movement in Alberta faces today.
Exactly, and if they don't have principles that say you are allowed to do this, then you just get arrested law.
Well, it's true, and like I say, and I was on strike at the Calgary Herald here in 1999 and 2000, and we, middle class, mostly male, mostly white workers were criminalized, and it was an eye-opening education for me, because it changed my attitudes about minority groups, because I was forced to see the world through their eyes. So it does happen, and we do, at least to a significant degree. Democracy depends, as I said earlier, on an agreement in society that we will conduct ourselves democratically.
Speaking of democracy, I feel the need to press on. There's a lot of people who are still waiting. Thanks for your comments.
All right.
Hi. My question's mainly for Marc S. I found that your arguments, I can't say I entirely disagree with your conclusions, but I found that I think that my perspective, I should start with, is that I'm an academic here. I'm a student. I believe in academics and the value of universities, but I've also worked in the oil patch for several years, so I've seen people. I've been with this culture that is very anti-university, is very distrustful. It is the people that are trying to push these things through because they feel like the public, which is them, which is uneducated, they dislike university professors, they don't trust them, they think they're pushing a bias, they're trying to push this through because they think they're pushing back against it. I do think the Alberta government, that is what they're trying to do with this, I agree with that. But I found your arguments, I found they work against you in that way, because I find you're very retreative, and you're saying, this form, you're kind of degrading this form, but I feel like by the standards of people I used to work with, this is super academic. This is more than they ever consider watching or going with. And I feel like if you're going to tackle the broader political context, I feel like if somebody here was the person I'm describing, an uneducated person, doesn't like professors, they think, oh, they're a bunch of SJWs, they're trying to control our society from our universities. What would your argument be for that person, showing that there is responsibility and that the university professors should be able to do what they want and that the Chicago principles aren't necessary?
I mean, that's kind of easy question to ask, and you could get a very long-winded answer. Part of the issue, though, is that actually what academics do is opaque to a lot of people. I'm not trying to degrade this forum specifically. This is the third forum I've participated in with Rational Space, so that should tell you something. I think there is value in these kinds of discussions sometimes. My point was that my point was that no one should think, if they're a member of the general community who are not involved in the academic community, no one should think this is how academics go about their daily lives as academics. What academics actually do is a very slow, painstaking, rigorous process, and it's very difficult for people who are outside of that academic community to have a clear sense of how academia actually moves forward. I'm not sure I can, in 2 minutes or 5, explain all that away for someone who doesn't quite understand it. What I can tell you as someone who's been working on a university campus for almost 20 years, not counting my time as a graduate student, but as a member of the faculty, they are extremely, there are places where a freedom of inquiry is valued very, very highly, actually, and where there's a lot of careful thought given to critique and to understanding different theoretical framings and so on. It's not, groupthink groupthink takes place in any society, in any community of people, but it is actually a place where individualism and individual thought and inquiry is actually valued very highly. I'll give you one really quick example, okay, because there's more people behind you. I think a great example of tolerance on campus, for example, we have anti-abortion protesters on campus, sometimes multiple times a week, depending on the time of the year. But I mean, I think over the past 5 to 10 years, they've probably been on campus protesting on Main Street, the main hallway here, hundreds and hundreds of times, literally. And occasionally there will be some counter-protesters, for example. There are faculty and students who speak out against their presence. My view is and courts have opined on this, that they actually have a right to be here, at least in that space, not to barge into a classroom, but in the more public spaces of the campus. They have a right to be there whether I agree with their message or not. The real message there is they've been passed by passers-by in the hallway probably hundreds of thousands of times if you did the math on that, and no one has, there have been no students or faculty who have tried to wrestle them to the ground or anything like that. The real story is how tolerant people have actually been, even though many people may actually disagree with their message. That's one anecdote, but it maybe helps to paint a picture of actually what my experience of a campus is, which is as a very intellectually free environment. By the way, freedom of expression is not freedom from criticism. So if someone is expressing things that are that their colleagues think is wrong or intellectually flawed, that they will be critiqued. That's not a violation of their academic freedom or their free expression. It's simply how the academy works.
I have to jump in here because Marc and I are obviously, we disagree about the current climate at Mount Royal. We're still friends. And I like to talk to Marc because Marc gives me a view that I need to consider, and I need to, and I respect his intellect. So if he's thinking it, I have to think, how could someone who's as intelligent as Marc be thinking of this thing? But I think in terms of the situation at Mount Royal, and I don't think we're that different from other places, it's not about not being subjected to criticism. That is totally expected. But there are a group of professors here who want to try to stop people from speaking about things. They're trying to figure out how to do it, and hate speech is one way they're trying to figure out how to do it, and the psychological harm, occupational health and safety is another way they're trying to do it. And just the abortion example, at least one professor is trying to get administration to have the anti-abortion people barred from campus. And the more disturbing aspect, which is happening, is that when you say that a professor, by saying ideas, criticizing Islam, for example, or saying that ethnic diversity harms social trust, or trans activism negatively impacts women's rights, all these kinds of hot topics. When you say that that is harmful to students, when you're making that claim, you are opening up a door where a professor could be investigated for not doing their proper duty at the university. And I think that is a very alarming kind of trend, which I'm personally quite worried about. Because I think that exposing people to ideas and critically examining things should not be seen as being harmful. If it's seen as being harmful, then we shouldn't be doing it. That seems to me to be the implication. So I think that's the dangerous thing, not that there's all that much overt kind of action to stop people from speaking, but creating a climate where the discussion of ideas is seen as potentially resulting in all sorts of violent activity or psychologically harming people. I think that's the problem.
I might disagree with Francess here, because I do think much of what we do is not only potentially harmful, but has caused harm. I think that the good, though, outweighs the harm. And I think one of the good is to create opportunities for people to become morally and intellectually autonomous.
How is it harmful, Marc?
Well, some people's identities, aspects of their identity mean very much to them, and they are psychologically distraught because by hearing ideas that challenge or get under those ideas. Now, I think that one of the things that happens at a university is that people come to be different types of people for whom challenging aspects of one's identity is no longer harmful. But I think there are many people who not many, I don't know how many, but there are people who have left university because they find it inhospitable. Inhospitable, why? Well, because they're not open to intellectual inquiry. They're not open to the life of an intellectual. But we want there to be the opportunity for people who would respond well to that sort of life to experience it. Kids come out of high school, they've never had that opportunity, and wow, it's wonderful for them, and they love it. So I think the risk of harm, the risk of psychological harm by discussing controversial and controversial ideas that can challenge aspects of people's identities is real, and we ought to be aware of that. I think, though, that the good outweighs the bad, and that because, ultimately, if we want to think of ourselves as a democracy where we're making our own minds, I mean, we need people who have moral and intellectual autonomy, at least to some degree. Let me just sort of the last thing. Intellectuals are never offended. You can't be offended if you are an intellectual. Why? Because you take what you hear and you hold it at arm's length and you ask, well, what are the reasons in favor of this view? What are the reasons against this view? What are the reasons in favor of the reasons against this view? it becomes an object of intellectual inquiry. And you may very well discover that the criticism is apt, and you might change some aspect of your identity because of that. But once you've become, or somewhere on the road to intellectual and moral autonomy, you can't experience offense anymore.
Let me just add, maybe a way of mediating this is by considering the concept of, I talked about this before, wrongful harm. So I agree that people can be harmed as a result of, I can tell you, you just failed my course, you're not going to get into law school or whatever. So people can be harmed, but we make judgments about what constitutes wrongful harm, and that's an evaluative standard that we can use to justify saying things that, I mean, maybe, I'm not going to use examples, I'll stay away from that. But I think maybe that's what we're looking for here, this evaluative standard. And then it's a question of what constitutes the right evaluative standard. Did you want to say something?
No, just, well, thanks for all your responses, yeah. I thought, I was just trying to bring up the point that, like, universities, I do agree they're under attack, and I'm just saying, like, you have to carry two books. Convince your fellow academics, and convince these hordes of masses that just want to break open the doors and mess everything up, so thank you very much.
Thanks for your question. Thanks for your patience. Should get a chair for, now we've got, we've got 42 minutes.
Oh, good. What's that?
Okay, so I just want to question and talk about the concept of marginalized groups, because that's been brought up by at least two of the speakers here. It seems to me that we have this system now where it all cuts back to the 1960s. No matter how much society changes, no matter how much time goes by, it's always set in stone the way society was in the 1960s. That's who the privileged groups are, and the marginalized groups are the ones that were marginalized back in the 1960s. So it doesn't matter if Obama becomes president. You can go into cases. Sorry, just flip over to this quick case here I think is very interesting. In America, the United States, they've tended to separate Asians from blacks with affirmative action. So in the U.S., Asians are traditionally in university hiring being told that they're a privileged group. And you can read these very bitter stories about Asians applying to universities in the U.S. that they've been excluded because they've been banned because as a group their math marks have been very high, etc. Right? Meanwhile, in Canada, we tend to lump everybody in together as what's the phrase again? Sorry, just trying to do this phrase again.
People of color, perhaps?
That's not the one. It's
diverse people.
what's the phrase?
People from historically marginalized groups?
Persons of. I'm sorry, I just don't have the phrase right now. It's like it's visible minorities. Sorry, didn't get that one. Visible minorities. So Asians are grouped in with other groups as visible minorities, and we seem to be very reluctant to look into this to separate them. But the understanding tends to be that basically it's the same in America and Canada, how good Asians are doing in the economy, how good they're doing in universities. But in one case, they're considered marginalized and therefore allowed to be accepted as quota students. And in the other case, they're considered to be privileged and are banned under affirmative action in many places. And so, the short of all this is you can come through all these examples. Another classic one would be transgenderism versus women's rights right now. If you look at sports leagues, that's technically an affirmative action that we have separate leagues of men's and women's sports. And now we're bringing in transgendered persons, and it seems to be the story right now is that we're going to side with transgendered as being more marginalized than women's groups. Therefore, we're basically going to use an affirmative action program to tear down another affirmative action program and tell the people that after years of, no, you may not impose affirmative action, that you can't defend your affirmative action program because there's a bigger affirmative action program we need.
So I'm losing that thread.
So the short of it all,
What is your question?
my question is, when we get into marginalized groups and rights and all the rest of it, why is it that, why do universities seem to be so slow in adopting? Why do we seem to be why do we only want the rights to be with the one group in the first place, the so-called marginalized group? And why why do we allow a system that basically sets in stone? You know, I don't see who it is that makes these decisions. I'm not seeing group decisions being made right now on transgender versus women's rights. I'm seeing it imposed, so you can basically, you know, talk these issues as you please.
That sounds like a contentious empirical question, but I'll be happy to let one of the panelists.
Well, I'm not entirely sure what the question is, and I don't know how it links to free expression and the Chicago principles.
Well, my question, okay, you seem to be presumptive, though, of the phrase marginalized groups. You seem to be given this special status to that we have to be afraid that we might offend or further marginalize the so-called marginalized groups. And I don't see where the proof is that what we're calling the marginalized groups are necessarily still the marginalized groups, or why it even follows that only the so-called marginalized groups are entitled to any rights.
I don't think that's what I said. I didn't say that certain groups were entitled to rights and others weren't. If that's what you got from it, that's not what I was saying. I was making a point specifically with respect to the Chicago principles and how they position freedom of expression as the singular value of the university. My point was that universities, when they set their policy for themselves, not as dictated or constrained by government, when universities have discussions about their own policies, yes, academic freedom is something that they need to take into account, but there are other considerations they need to be alive to. And we don't have time to go into the years of research that educational researchers have done about marginalization discourses, and I wasn't talking about any particular group, but it has been well studied by researchers in academia that there are members of certain communities who feel they have less of a right to a higher education than others, right? And when they get to university, they may also encounter some of those discourses, these narratives that are essentially, and they've internalized them in many cases, essentially questioning, their right or their ability to be there. Right? So there is research on this. We don't have time to go through it. But my point is that when a university is thinking about freedom of expression issues or academic freedom issues on campus, it's completely legitimate to think about those issues too. They shouldn't be constrained by a government and limited to only looking at it from one narrow perspective. So I'll give one example that maybe helps to make it clear. Mount Royal University, like many campuses in Alberta, has been subject on occasion to waves of anti-Islamic, Islamophobic postering on campus. So we've had incidents where, overnight posters have appeared, talking about Islamic students and so forth. What does that kind of, if a member of that community sees a poster like that, what is the message that they're taking away? Again, these are groups that have not historically participated in higher education in Canada. Higher education in Canada, like in much of the Western world, has been fairly elite until the waves of massification starting in the 1950s. So what is the message they take from that? Essentially, someone is trying to position them as being a person who cannot bring the fabric of their life experience to the university, that somehow if they want to show up, they have to carve off a part of their identity, and that there's someone else who's allowed to essentially mediate their participation and say how they are allowed to show up and how they aren't. And participation in classrooms and on campuses is not equally easy for everybody. Right? People.
Well, doesn't this mirror though the?
So my point.
Christian fundamentalists were excluded from university.
No, my point is just that a question that has come up at Mount Royal is: should the university have taken those posters down, and should the administration have issued a statement saying that people of all walks of life are welcome? I think the answer to those two questions is yes.
Now, let me interrupt there. So you are.
Sorry.
Your name?
Oh, Jeff.
Jeff, I'm going to invite you to speak to the panel members after the 5 o'clock time if you want to talk further. Instead, I'd like to give the next person a chance to speak.
But so how's that different though, the
No,
Islamic
maybe-
experience and the Christian fundamentalist experience?
Like I
Related
said,
to this, Bill, just quickly, just finish up with this sentence. Isn't there a reality of the case that the reason that Jason Kenney is in power and trying to impose this is because he's associated with basically Christian fundamentalist groups that felt that they were excluded from Alberta from the 1990s to present?
I'm not aware of that, no.
Hi.
I think it's.
So because the Chicago principles are a fairly new policy that has been implemented, how do you see it playing out in the long run in terms of like the university campus? Not politically, but
I'm very pessimistic about universities these days.
about which parts exactly?
Well,
Or do you see that as threatened by these
well,
principles?
no, I think that the move back to universities of oversight and control well, I think it's a worrying phenomenon. I think it is a real phenomenon. I think the idea of the University of Liberal Study, and again, I don't think it's ever been a majority conception, even among university people. But I think what we're going to have to do now is sort of keep the idea of University of Liberal Study alive one way or another, and create contexts where people who want to participate in liberal study can at universities. I think we're moving back to the idea that a university is a place to produce people to take their positions in the professional and managerial elites, that they are to leave university with the skills that are useful for those positions and have the right attitudes to benefit society from those positions. The idea that research should be aimed toward alleviating social problems. Nothing wrong with that. Of course, in liberal study, what really matters to us is that we're engaged with those intellectual problems that intrigue us. So I'm somewhat pessimistic, but I think that there are ideals worth keeping alive and implementing in practice as best we can when the conception of the university as a place of liberal study is a minority position at the university, and the university overall is a place of order and control. And I think the initiatives, ideas like the Chicago Principles are to make the university a freer and more hospitable place for intellectuals.
anyone else?
Well, I do. I guess I feel, I was making some notes here while I was thinking about this, but that I think that this policy will be used to advance the narrative that Marc made reference to, that universities are in trouble, that they're hotbeds of political correctness, totalitarian political correctness, as someone else said. And that in turn will be used in an effort to stifle or at least defang criticism of the government over time. So this is probably not the most serious problem, social problem that we face in our society, but it is a problem for the university. It also then extended becomes an excuse to defund and more tightly control universities. So I do see, at least for the life of the UCP government, which will probably be more than one term in my view, that this will be a cause of continuing tension. So in that sense, I'm not terribly optimistic about good things flowing from the Chicago Principles.
Well, I do agree that I think I'm suspicious of the motives of imposing them, but I do think we have a problem. I'm amazed, and this is why I seem to live in a different universe than Marc S. and David are talking about. Perhaps it's because I undertake controversial research myself, so I witness the kinds of reactions that I get from it and the kind of attitudes which are expressed, which are not academic attitudes, which are not intellectual attitudes. They're emotional, ideological attitudes, which are, we've already decided how we're supposed to think about this, and if you raise these questions, you are going to have these negative consequences for various groups, and you should be concerned about that. And you should sort of limit your speech, and you should shape your ideas and so on to be, and there's many ways these ideas are phrased, but they are very anti-intellectual positions, what I see on a daily basis. And I think that's a serious problem for the university. It doesn't mean that it's a crisis and everything's falling apart, but it means that it is a disturbing trend which has to be, to some extent, pushed back against. And I think this is a real concern. How much of a concern it is, is still to be determined, but the fact that you have anti-intellectual professors at a university who are saying you should not explore this idea because of all these perceived consequences is very alarming.
For me, there's a huge sense of deja vu here because a previous government in Alberta imposed codes of conduct, or the requirement that universities and colleges develop codes of conduct about 5 years ago now, I'm going to say. And the government had actually required of these codes of conduct they address fiduciary matters. For example, members of boards of governors and senior administrators. It was really an attempt to make sure that people in positions of administrative and governance power at the institution didn't have conflicts of interest and that sort of thing. But without a doubt, though that got turned around at Alberta universities and colleges, and administrations turned those into attempts to bring in all kinds of problematic requirements and codes for employees and faculty, saying silly, vague things like it required them to uphold the reputation of the university and so forth. We went through this with the previous government. Faculty associations, including ours, pushed back fairly aggressively. In fact, so aggressively that the administration couldn't really back down. And at the Board of Governors meeting where the Code of Conduct was approved by the board, the president announced right afterwards that he knew it was problematic and that they would immediately strike a committee that included the faculty association and staff in redrafting a version that solved, that addressed the criticism. So we got a victory out of that. My point here is that we actually went through with the administration over the course of more than a year, drafting principles in our code of conduct for the university that actually upheld things like the value of rigorous debate and so forth, as well as a bunch of other principles too. We did that hard work. And so that's why for me it's so frustrating that now we have a government that is probably completely unaware of that history and is coming in and is telling us to redo it, but according to their own narrow set of constraints. So where's this going to go? I think we're going to be stuck in the perpetual, back and forth of politics. Unfortunately, I don't think this issue is ever going to go away. If history is any indicator of the future, we're going to be continually pushed and pulled by the political winds of the day. I do agree with David. I think this is, our government has an interest, I think, in defanging universities. And again, subordinating them to private sector interests. So I think that's something, at least for the next 4 years, we're going to be contending with.
Thanks. Can I have a quick follow-up?
Yeah, sure.
You kept saying that the document was too vague, and now you say that the narrative's too narrow. So, which is?
Oh, I meant the when I said. You know the Chicago principles specifically? When I say the Chicago principles are framed too narrowly, what I mean is they are specifically and singularly about freedom of speech in U.S. terms, right? But how the principles propose dealing with freedom of speech issues is not at all unclear. It's not at all clear, I should say. Right? So it says freedom of speech is this primary value that we hold at our University of Chicago, and how we deal with it. Well, there may be situations where we need to regulate the time and place and manner of expression, and someone will figure that out. It's simultaneously narrow and vague. Vague doesn't mean general necessarily.
Wouldn't that allow the university to have teeth in the issue, though, in the sense that the Chicago Principles doesn't tell you what freedom of expression is, but it just tells you how to protect it.
Well, it doesn't tell us how to protect freedom of
Doesn't it
rigorous
give the
inquiry
university
at
teeth to
all.
make its own decisions?
Sorry?
Doesn't it give the university teeth to make its own decisions?
So my point, it's simply adopting the Chicago principles doesn't tell you anything about how you actually deal with difficult issues when they actually arise, like in a situational context, right? It sounds nice as a general statement. I think as a document, it gives us no real guidance in how we actually address difficult issues when they arise. Right? So, yeah, you can do that work. That's the work we did with our code of conduct, right? When we actually sat down with administration after pushing back on a much vaguer version and tried to hash out some more specific details and refine the language. It's still not perfect. But if anyone thinks we can simply adopt the Chicago principles and now we've got a roadmap for how we deal with difficult, contentious issues on campus and how the administration's going to decide what's offensive and decide how to regulate time and place, they're sadly mistaken. It doesn't tell us how to do that at all.
But I do not think that that's the intent of this document. I think the intent of this document is to form the basis around which we can have a kind of a mission. So more of a mission statement kind of approach. And we're already seeing this a little bit in the discussions, is that there's nothing that the Chicago principles that are there, which I disagree with, and I support what is being put forward. There are colleagues that I know that do not agree with them. So in that sense, it's formed the basis of the beginning of a conversation about why some faculty members are opposed to these principles, which I think we've gotten to a little bit. I think, unfortunately, that conversation about the marginalized groups got off the rails a little bit, but I think that's a key one. You know, this thing which Marc was talking about, which happened, you know, posters saying things like Islam is cancer, that was the nature of the statements, you know, and how that should have been expressed and so on, but it is a difficulty to be critical of Islam when you're going to say, well, that's going to make it difficult for people who believe in Islam to come to campus, and they're not going to feel that they're going to be able to participate, and you're demanding that they strip part of their identity away. Those sorts of arguments. That means that we cannot critically discuss religion generally, and then Islam as a specific ideology, which is part of religion. Like these sorts of things, that's kind of the worrying aspect of it. And that's the kind of conversation I think we need to have, which is starting to congeal a little bit because of this document, because we can sort of look at these paragraphs, a couple of them which have been read out, which are very significant, which are about, you know, civility, and that should not be used to shut down ideas. The kind of language in here, which, you know, has certain parallels. I think that's the value of it. Not that it's going to be able to be used as some kind of roadmap for the future, but it's a starting point to get a sense of what the different kind of perspectives are and how we can work through those and discuss them. I think that's the benefit.
Thank you. Thanks for your patience.
No problem. I have to apologize in advance. I missed most of the discussion. So I have two questions. The first one is one focused on David. In your opening statement, you talked about the U.S. Constitution and how essentially the elites use it to keep their essentially their paradigms set in stone. But I would challenge that with in the 1970s, when the civil rights movements and the women's rights movements were emerging, and the U.S. justices who were appointed at that time, they staunchly defended free speech because it mattered to them because they were left-leaning. And today you'll find those same justices are on there. And anyone who challenges free speech today, if any case goes to the Supreme Court, they will get basically shut down immediately because it's still free speech. And the judges understand that the coin could toss on them at any time, and so they will always defend it. So I was just wondering what you would think about that. And then for my second question, I would just ask the panel if they could give an anecdote or just an overview of what happened on university campuses during the Red Scare, because obviously I would see that as a polar opposite of what's happening today.
Well, just in response to your first point, I think what I said is that the U.S. Constitution is an example of a document that doesn't necessarily mean what it says on its face. Oh, and I'm rolling the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution together for the founding documents of the United States for the purposes of this point, or this argument. But I also said, as you'll recall, that the American Civil War in the 1860s changed the direction, and I think that's the answer to the point you're making, is that the interpretation of the Constitution has been different since the Civil War. Now, that's an evolving process too, but I don't think you can say the point that I want to make about the U.S. Constitution is a point about what it meant in 1776, but as an example of what we deal with documents of this sort. I agree with you that the commitment of the American establishment to robust and open free speech has been pretty broad compared to most democracies. Although there's lots of other things we can criticize for the Americans for if we want to get into it. But I mean, I really think the turning point is the 1860s. Anyway, I think that addresses, I hope, the point you made for me. So I'll pass on the rest to the others.
Well, about the Red Scare, Ellen Trecker's book is pretty good. I don't know if you've read it, about the very bad behavior of many universities during that period, and the inability of unions and others to fight back there. But I don't know what exactly the parallel would be. I mean, there are many different ways in which academic freedom of expression on campus and the rest are come under pressure and come under attack. I don't know that there are that many similarities between what was happening from the House Un-American Activities Committee and today.
I was just under the impression that the current push for the Chicago Principles was, of course, by Jason Kenney, the right-wing party, versus in the 1960s how the American governments were concerned, of course, with communism ideals spreading and universities being bastions of where the ideas essentially were fostered, and if the government and putting kind of like sanctions on those universities or what kind of conduct the administration put on their faculty.
Right. Okay. I see.
I think with,
The Red Scare is not my area of expertise by any stretch, so I'm hesitant to comment on that specifically. Of course, the Chicago Principles didn't, they originated at the University of Chicago, but Jason Kenney is not the first conservative politician to champion them. I mean, I think, and David touched on this in his original, in his first set of minutes. But I mean, the uptake and push for the Chicago Principles is something that, of course, originated in the U.S. Among Republicans and has spread to Canada, and it's kind of like a virus,
I was going to
right?
say a virus.
That's essentially kind of found its way into conservative policy or election platforms and so on. There's a bigger thing going on here than just Jason Kenney taking it up for his own, because he has some own personal axe to grind. I think it's part of a narrative or an attempt to establish a narrative that goes well beyond just what's going on in Alberta. But as to the Red Scare specifically, I don't want to opine about something that's well outside my area.
I think that one of the reasons why the Kenney government wants to bring in the Chicago Principles is that there is a perception that those with conservative ideas are being constrained and not being able to speak. And whether that's how much truth there is in that or not, I don't know. But this is the difficulty, is that if you're a freedom of expression advocate, you have to be a principled freedom of expression advocate. You have to advocate for the anti-abortion protesters, the people who are critical of homosexuality or whatever issues, versus saying that the people who want to say that the bourgeoisie should be killed. Those kinds of comments, you have to support those comments too. It shouldn't just be, oh, I'm only going to support those people that I agree with. It is open inquiry, let the ideas be put forward, defeat the ideas that are misguided. That's the approach I think that should be at a university.
Paul?
Yeah, just wanted to, first of all, mention to Marc that I too was very disappointed in your comments that these rational space events are punching down, as you put it. I can't understand how you would think that, for instance, our forum on, is capitalism sustainable, punching down in some way. I think maybe you don't see value in forums of this kind for discussion of difficult topics, but people can vote with their feet. Obviously, there are a lot of people here that do. The attendance has been fairly good at these. We don't have a culture of seminars at Mount Royal University. I think it's partly because we're not a graduate school. And so I personally found, Francess's initiative and getting these going to be quite refreshing. The notion that, some professors don't want to participate here because, if we want to know what they think, we can read their papers. They don't want to talk to these people. I find that very ivory tower and a disappointing viewpoint. I like to hear how people express their ideas and how they respond to questions. Personally, I guess we're all different kinds of learners. Anyway, my question actually is for David. So David, you mentioned that these Chicago principles would be a way of opening the door for people to come in and disrupt university life. I mean, it seems to me that when I looked at the Chicago principles, I thought, well, really, we're already doing this. At least verbally, I've heard administration even say many times these kinds of statements. I think in practice, there are some issues at Mount Royal, and I mentioned a couple in my opening remarks today. But I think there's some interesting parallels with journalism, not that I understand exactly what the world of journalism is like, but you mentioned that, there's some impetus, at least in your training, for journalists to try to get the opposing view on the story, but sometimes you don't do that if in your evaluation, the opposing view is not credible, and so that you would not necessarily seek out those opinions. Well, I think that, and that's your training that's coming to the fore there. So professors are trained as well. I don't see, tons of nutters, flooding the campus with crazy ideas and so on, because by and large, speakers are invited by professors, and there's already a filter there of training years and years to sort of get a sense of what's credible. Now, obviously, people make mistakes as determining what's credible and what's not, and the history of science is replete with examples. Had some of the early geologists that were thinking about continents moving and so on have been completely shut down because their ideas were perceived by the majority as not credible.
Meteorologist, by the way.
That's
Wegener was a
right.
meteorologist.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, Wegener was a meteorologist, and not even in the discipline of geology, and he ended up, revolutionizing our whole understanding of the planet. But anyway, the question is, how do you decide who's credible? I mean, presumably, journalists are, in a sense, making the same kinds of decisions that professors are when it comes to inviting speakers with sometimes controversial ideas onto campuses.
I don't think the issue is controversial speakers who are invited by professors to their classrooms or to events like this. I think the potential danger here, the potential risk is people who will invade the campus with the intention of creating disorder, and when they're pushed off will use statements like this and the atmosphere that they're designed to, the narrative they're designed to push as an argument for forcing their way back onto campus. And I think it's a fair point you make that the really, and I made it too in my opening remarks, that there really hasn't been much of a problem of this sort, but I say to you, just wait. And you actually put something else in my mind that I wanted to talk about, and I wanted to respond to a point that Jeff, the speaker who has left, made, that he didn't have a chance to hear, but he was right to say that Mr. Kenny has identified with and relies on, for support, a group of extremely social conservative people who identify themselves as Christians. And he was right to say that that group of people perceive themselves as being persecuted. And I think where he was going, although I could be wrong, was the suggestion that they are in fact persecuted, which I think is nonsense. But I think that is one of the groups. I mean, we've seen on the University of Alberta campus in Edmonton anti-abortion groups coming in and pushing very hard and being pretty offensive and pretty, as I understand it, although I haven't seen this myself, pretty physical in their confrontation with students. So who disagree with them. So that is, I think, the danger. Now, as for journalism, I have to say, I spent a lot of years in journalism, but I've been out of journalism now for a lot of years too, so things have changed. But the training was always to try and find the alternative view. Part of my critique of that is that in some cases, the alternative view is not worth pursuing. But that's my view, but that's not necessarily the view of, I'm going to call it the profession. It's not really a profession or a trade. It's something else. I don't know if any of you have read Hunter S. Thompson's Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas.
Of course we
But
have.
there's an excellent little description in there of what journalism really is, and I'm not going to say it here. It's pretty good.
Thanks.
Paul, you didn't ask me a question, but I feel I need to respond anyway. So I think you're misrepresenting what I said about academics who were invited to come and didn't show up. I didn't say that people who want to know their views should just go read what they've written. They can. My point is they can do that. If it's, I think a characterization or an accusation that's often leveled against people who decline to show up is that, they're afraid to engage in a debate. No, I think it goes back to something I was saying earlier, which is that for academics who study particular topics, they spend years reading journal articles, attending conferences, writing papers, going through multi-year cycles, getting them published, and sometimes their views cannot easily be distilled down to what they can easily present in a public debate. And so I think for many academics, I think your point earlier, sir, it's often easier for them to explain what their point of view their point of view in an essay. It's not that they're trying to hide from sharing their views or explaining them. It's that they don't necessarily view these forums and their formats as being a fruitful way of going about that. I'm not an ivory tower elitist at all. I actually am critical often of faculty who are not who don't try to play a larger role as public intellectuals. I actually think that's something that we haven't been particularly good at as academics in Canada, sharing our expertise and our views with the broader public. But there's multiple ways of doing that, and just because some people are critical of the rational space format doesn't mean they're hiding from explaining their views. As for the comment on punching down versus punching up, I just raised that as a challenge to Francess and the rest of the Rational Space. I'm not a member of Rational Space. I've participated as a panelist or a facilitator in 3 events and attended a whole bunch of other ones. So to say I don't see any value in them is a little weird. But the point is that if the real point of Rational Space is to bring forward controversial topics and show that we can actually discuss them rigorously and openly and rationally, then it does seem like there's a preponderance of issues that involve discussing members of marginalized groups. I think it would be much more interesting if Rational Space tried to do what it says it wants to do by picking issues that actually deal with systemic power and the people who hold those positions. So why not, for example, discussing world capitalism versus socialism, that's pretty broad, right? What about a question that is much more topical, like are oil and gas CEOs urging foot dragging on climate change out of economic self-interest, right? That might raise the ire of the broader community, at least on the right, who might really put the heat on you in a much more intense way than you've ever had the heat put on you before. Why don't you do more of that? That's a challenge
all the more
to
reason
you.
why you should be joining Rational Space.
Anyway, I have to jump in here because this is a major issue. In terms of Rational Space events last year, we had one event that could have been portrayed as that in terms of a marginalized group. But and this is the person who left, this was the point I think he was trying to make, who is the marginalized group? There's the intersectional feminists who are aligned with the trans activists who are just basically trying to mob the feminists who are making criticisms about trans activism. It's the feminists who are making criticisms of trans activism who are marginalized. They get no play. So this whole thing about framing it in terms of marginalized versus oppressive, it really is a very contentious area. And you know, we had that one event, and rightly so. It was an issue that was the first time at a university in Canada that issue was discussed. And Megan Murphy was not allowed to discuss that issue at Wilfrid Laurier University. So why shouldn't we as Rational Space be the first university, Mount Royal University, to look at trans activism? It was obviously an issue that we should get into, but I really don't think that is a fair characterization to look at us as wanting to go look at groups that are marginalized and punch down on them. I really seriously object to that.
Point noted. We only have 2 more minutes. Peter, you're waiting.
Maybe I'll let you go ahead. I'm a member of the Rational Space, you go ahead. You ask the question.
Hopefully I articulate this clearly. I'm philosophy grad student. I'm yet to defend my thesis, hopefully. I came to academia late in life. I went for the first time at 44 years old. So I come from a lower working class background, and I have brought different perspectives with me. My disciplinary interest is in social epistemology, the social dimensions of knowledge, how people come to their beliefs, how they maintain beliefs. And one comment I want to make, both coming from having a life before academia, which is far from academic, and the studies that I've embarked on are that what we do in academia, I'm sorry, Marc, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit, are not so opaque to what, say, the public does. There are different standards and methodologies. There's different ways we evaluate our beliefs, the way we vet, and that sort of thing. We do have some checks and balances, such as peer review and that sort of thing. And we're working specifically on things that other people are working on with us on particular problems. But a lot of the work we do are in the hallways, over lunch tables. When we go to conferences, it's not that we go there necessarily. We hear what people are working on, and that's very exciting. But a lot of the fruitful discussion comes in the hallways and dinners later on, email exchanges, friendships made, barbecues. A lot of the work and the ideas and working these through are talking to each other. That's just what humans do. So, in that light, we also get to know when we sit down at the lunch tables and we're standing in the hallways and whatnot, particularly I'm a student, say I'm overhearing professors' discussions and we're making note of particular views professors hold, and some are very vocal about and very, very critical and very impassioned. Sometimes I think we're not going to, I think the upshot here is that we know when there's a lot of fist punching and whatnot, what kind of research we're not even going to begin to investigate. So there are lines of inquiry and questions we know not to ask, or we're very afraid to. And there are some examples that, you know, that we oughtn't. You know, we see what's happening to our colleagues, or, you know, that didn't go well, I have to protect my GPA. Say even, you know, even the untenured professors in these positions to some degree, if I speak up, you know, I could subvert my career. I mean, a lot of things we do, and it's no fault, we don't have any other way to do this, so I don't really know what to do about it. But we depend on letters of reference and recommendations. You know, there's I don't have a good answer to this, and I don't know that we'll ever get around it, but we do self-censor. We are mindful of how this is going to bear on our lives and careers. We do bear, I think it's not a trivial thing to worry about our friendships and the people we depend on for what I say is our survival, delectation, and companionship. These are very important human needs, and when we are in jeopardy of being ostracized from a community we depend on in this way for our survival and delectation, it's a lot of pressure. So I don't, maybe this is more a comment than a question, maybe you could speak to that, how, and how maybe the, right off, maybe something like the Chicago principles or statement might help a few people be able to come forward and to say we perhaps support this kind of discourse and well.
I agree with you. I think the situation you described is both real and terrible. The censoriousness is, well, I mean, think of the Rebecca Tuval case with her article. Happily, there were some good things about it. I think the philosophical community in the end showed itself to be not too bad, but right off the bat, you know, it was pretty bad. And so I do think that something like a university statement in favor of freedom of expression on campus, in favor of professors and students creating their careers, creating or investigating the problems they want, might go some way toward creating a culture where people can present ideas that, you know, that might be very controversial, and the members of the university community will look at it as a thesis. What are the arguments for? What are the arguments against? And discuss it. And that's what we want in a university community, where what we're interested in are the ideas as ideas, and to investigate them as ideas, and not to cast aspersions on the people who pronounce these ideas, certainly not to exclude them from the various communities, invite them to the parties and all the rest as well. So yes, I think what you say is true and unfortunate. We want to be able to create a community where we can be critical, not censorious, take the ideas as ideas, and not castigate the people who pronounce those ideas.
Allow me to interject. I feel my responsibility as timekeeper conflicting with my interest in carrying on more discussion, so maybe we should invite people who want to carry on more discussion to come and speak to the panel members. But now I'd like to say thanks again to our sponsors and to all of you for attending the forum. I hope you found it informative and interesting. Thanks also to our panel members, and have a good night. See you. Thank you very much.
Way to go, Marc.